Second Chance in Hawk Ridge Hollow. Rich and Rugged, a Hawkins Brother romance. Written by Ellie Hall. Copyright 2019. Narrated by Lorena Hoops. Audio copyright 2020. Chapter 1. Sadie. They say Valentine's Day is for sweethearts, but Sadie Collins was feeling rather anti-love as she strode through the lobby of the Hawk Ridge Hollow Hotel and Resort. It wasn't that she didn't like love. She wasn't a monster. Nor did she particularly want to be single. It was just that the bouquets of red, pink, and white flowers reminded her that roses had thorns. The strawberries, arrayed beneath the fountain overflowing with melted deliciousness for guests, reminded her that chocolate could be bitter. And the garlands, strung around the lobby along with twinkly lights set against the backdrop of the ski and winter recreation town, reminded her of how dim her life had become. Sadie didn't want to see blatant reminders of what she didn't have, what she'd lost. Even though it was still days until the holiday, she was already planning on hiding under the covers with a book or movie about anything that didn't have to do with romance. Conventions of cheesemaking during the 19th century, gardening in Zone 7A, or perhaps a sports documentary. She was definitely a hockey fan. The clock, audible indoors and ringing from the town's square, prompted her to quicken her pace, because she was already late returning from her lunch break. Her boss's assistant, Danielle, wouldn't cover her. If anything, she'd be sure to let Morgan know that Sadie was late. Again. Leaving the house wasn't easy, and not because she was busy scrolling her social feed, with everyone crowing about their Valentine's Day plans. She was on a phone detox. She didn't hate her job. It wasn't her dream job, but the benefits were necessary. And she wasn't irresponsible. Quite the opposite, all things considered. A little girl skipped alongside her mother, holding a heart-shaped balloon. It started to float away. Sadie raced after it, anticipating the little girl being upset if she lost it. Even though Sadie was short, she managed to grab the end before it was out of reach. She held it out to the little girl, who thanked her with a big smile and a hug. She smiled and continued on her way. She hadn't gotten far when someone called her name. Sadie! Michael, her co-worker, flagged her down in a polite, hushed way so as not to draw the attention of guests in the lobby. The hotel was 5 stars and known for providing the perfect vacation experience. Above and beyond their regular duties, employees were expected to ensure guests felt comfortable, at ease, and relaxed. Shouting across a room would have been frowned upon. Sadie, he repeated. She slowed her stride. Even though Michael was in her department, guest experience development and promotion, this would make her even later. Morgan, her boss, didn't make exceptions for extenuating circumstances or sob stories. Not that Sadie thought of her situation that way, nor did she tell anyone at work about her personal life. No, she'd made that mistake 3 years ago at her old job about a different situation involving a shiny ring she'd hoped to find on her finger. Now she knew better than to hope or dream. What happened outside the workplace stayed outside the workplace. Michael took a deep breath and his eyes pinched at the sides. I need you to review the specs on the Valentine's Day couples package. It seems there's a computer glitch and an error of some sort. We've been getting calls all morning from guests trying to book, and something isn't right. I tried texting you and calling you. It was obvious he knew, but was too polite to say. She'd put her phone on airplane mode so it didn't interfere with things while she was on her lunch break. Her stomach dropped. If there was a problem on the website, it was entirely on her. She couldn't afford to screw it up. Morgan had given her exclusive control over the project as a challenge. A chance to prove she was the right person for the job and not the flighty and flaky employee they'd pinned her as. Danielle had wanted it, but Sadie had more experience. Despite the past and the fact that she'd been given Valentine's Day to work with, Sadie cared deeply about making people happy, providing them with opportunities to have great memories, and about the resort itself. She'd practically grown up there. Plus, there were matters in her life far more important than couples massage deals, romance room packages, and rose petal-strewn pathways during candlelit walks under the stars. One's reliant on her salary. She sighed. "I'll see that it gets fixed right away." "It's bad." Michael brushed his hand across his blonde brow. "I'm sure it is." She swallowed hard as she pressed the button for the elevator. The Hawk Ridge Hollow Resort, owned by the famed Hawkins family, was a top destination in the world for skiing, snowboarding, and other outdoor activities. The village was quaint, friendly, and had a chalet-style vibe that visitors and residents alike loved. The mountain itself was world-class and also owned by the Hawkins family. They didn't tolerate mistakes, and she knew this one, whatever it was, risked her job. "No, it's like bad," Michael hissed. The elevator dinged, and she got inside. "You know me. I'll fix it." She plastered on a reassuring smile. It seemed like her entire life revolved around putting bandages on broken things. Her family, her love life, her car, and now her job. Sometimes, literally. Gone were the days of living a free-spirited lifestyle. Michael continued to fret and warn her, but the elevator doors sealed her inside, and whatever else he said was lost. Sadie flipped her phone out of airplane mode and waited for it to find a signal before clicking to the resort website. She figured she'd better be prepared for whatever fires she had to put out. When it came to Morgan, preparation and pacification were key, because that woman sure knew how to make things blaze. The phone loaded slowly despite the Wi-Fi. She huffed at the same time the elevator suddenly jerked to a halt. Her hand caught the polished rail on the wall, and she knocked into the mirror with her shoulder. The lights flickered. She rubbed her arm. "Are you kidding me?" Sadie groaned. She pounded the buttons. "Come on!" The carriage didn't move. She tried the door open button repeatedly. Nothing. "Hello?" she called. The higher-ups and owners emphasized a smooth and pleasant experience for their guests, anticipating potential problems and preventing them, and maintaining their top-notch reviews as the perfect getaway locale. Surely that meant routinely servicing their elevators? Then again, she wasn't a guest. A guest package problem, and now the elevator stopping, was not going to go over well, particularly because it seemed they were both related to her. She knew it wasn't her fault the elevator stopped, but it was just her luck to have a delay in getting the website problem fixed, if she still had a job when she got to the office. Minutes passed, and she tried the buttons again. Still no movement. Sadie suddenly wished she'd taken the glass elevators closer to the reception area that overlooked the mountain, but she hadn't wanted to draw attention to her tardiness. At least then she'd be able to bang on the windows and someone would go for help. Although management wouldn't be pleased if she caused a fuss. It was a no-win situation. Her chest tightened. The four walls started to close in on her and her pulse began to race. She didn't realize she suffered from claustrophobia. Then again, she'd never been stuck in a small space like an elevator. Panicked thoughts drove in like a storm. What if she was stuck in there forever? She wasn't sure how many flights she was up. But there were 20 in that building since it housed the resort's operations on the upper floors. But what if she fell? What if she was fired? What if she was needed at home and no one could alert her? Sweat pierced her hairline and she rushed to the bank of buttons and pressed the one with the flames on it. This was an emergency. She couldn't bear to be stuck there for a moment longer. Bells rang sharply, and if no one had noticed the elevator had stopped, they would then. It also meant the reception desk would get dozens of calls and visits of concern, wondering if there was a fire, if they were safe, and some people might even demand a refund because their stay was interrupted by a disturbance bell in the remote elevator lobby. She pounded the button again. Panic set in. Her breathing became shallow. She had to get out of there. She didn't hear anything other than her ragged breath. The carriage didn't budge, siphoning away her hope that she'd soon be out of there. She flipped on her phone and texted Michael. "Can't fix web problem because I'm stuck in the elevator. SOS." Morgan wouldn't buy the story, so maybe he could back her up. She'd used every excuse she could come up with when she was a few minutes late. Most of them were real. Her car wouldn't start. She had a flat tire. Things took longer at home than she'd expected. She was caught in a parade, and she dropped her phone in the toilet one time. Morgan didn't care. She held onto her job by a thin string. Getting the couples' package had been the chance to fix things. Now precious minutes were ticking by, and she was trapped, helpless. "Deep breaths, Sadie," she said to herself. She knew freaking out didn't help matters, but that was easier said than done. Without much other choice than to wait it out, Sadie tapped on her phone and clicked the couples' package icon on the resort website. As the page loaded, she heard something from above and listened. "Hello," she called. Voices floated to her through the elevator shaft. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted, "Help!" A clinking echoed, and she backed into the corner and gripped the rails. Terrified the cables were going to give, like in the movies, and she'd plunge to her death, made her pulse quicken once more. She was needed at home. What would happen if she died? They hadn't planned for that circumstance. She squeezed her eyes shut and shouted, "Help! I'm stuck! Please help!" A tile in the ceiling slid aside, showering her with dust, and she winced. If the technicians couldn't get the elevator operating and had to stage a rescue, it had to be bad. At least if the doors had opened, she could have stepped onto solid ground and to safety. Whatever was next was just as frightening as being stuck in the carriage. "I'm stuck! Help me!" Her voice was merely a whimper, and a tear trailed down her cheek. She didn't want to die like that. A figure, wearing boots and pants with thick fabric, lowered through the opening in the ceiling. She closed her eyes as more dust showered down. "Miss, it's going to be okay," the voice said. It was deep, manly, and comforting, but oddly familiar. Wearing a harness, the firefighter faced away from her as he rappelled down and onto the floor of the elevator. The carriage shuddered as he dropped to his feet. She squeezed her eyes shut again, now terrified for 2 reasons. "Sadie?" the man asked. She opened her eyes. Her fears came true. It was Tripp Hawkins, firefighter and part owner of the resort, unless he hadn't gotten married yet. She'd purposely stopped keeping track of him after he'd left town. Also, he was Sadie's ex. She'd spent more hours than she'd like to admit rehearsing what she'd say when they came face to face again, and it was not, "Help! I'm stuck." Chapter 2. Tripp. Tripp Hawkins released the carabiner on the harness and stepped closer to Sadie. "Are you okay? Did you hit your head? Any abrasions?" He was in work mode, but a mixture of surprise and concern checkered his voice. He knew she'd been hurt badly in the past, not physically, but it was the biggest mistake of his life. She pushed off the rail she'd been gripping with white knuckles and straightened. She wore red heels and a stylish navy blue suit with red cherries on her blouse. The collar framed the cross her mother wore before she'd passed away when Sadie was young. She'd treasured it since she couldn't remember her except for photos and stories her father told. She smoothed her unruly strawberry blonde curly hair and lifted her chin. The pale skin on her throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. A sheen of sweat made her skin glow. Despite her state, she was as gorgeous as she was every single time he thought about her, which was more often than he dared admit. She was the one who got away, or rather, he'd let go. He'd regretted it every day since. She deserved better than a man like him. The silence passing between them grew palpable. "Are you okay?" he repeated. She cleared her throat. "Yes, I'm fine. A little shaken up." Her tone was sharp, icy. He had no idea she worked at his family's resort. Then again, he hadn't been back long enough to run into her. Hawk Ridge Hollow was a small town that swelled with tourists, so it was easy to blend in or stand out, depending on whether you wanted to be seen or not. He still wasn't sure how he felt about returning, but he'd been offered the position of captain at the Hawk Ridge Hollow Fire Hall and couldn't turn it down. As the eldest Hawkins brother, he felt he owed it to his family, community, and the resort to do his best to protect them, even if that meant returning to the place that brought him equal amounts of joy and pain. He'd run away once and vowed not to do it again. He blazed inside, and it wasn't because of his gear. His mind wanted to flee the discomfort that came from seeing Sadie again, but his heart knew better. "How are you?" he heard himself ask again. "I told you, I'm fine, a little shaken up," she repeated, in a voice colder than before. He cleared his throat, feeling slightly tongue-tied in her presence. He had so much to say to her, but this probably wasn't the time or place. He tamped down the intense emotions and switched back to work mode. "It's unacceptable for guests to be trapped in the elevator. I'll have a word with the owners. In the meantime, let's get you out of here." He reattached the harness and gave it a tug. "I'm not a guest, Tripp." Her gorgeous pout distracted him, even if she said his name with disdain. Then she added, "You mean you're not the owner?" He shook his head at the same time she glanced at his left hand. "If you're asking if I'm married, no. I suppose the right girl—" He let out a breath. The radio attached to his belt crackled. "Coming up," he responded. He gestured she move closer and held out a second harness. He helped her into it and adjusted the straps. She was trembling, and he wanted nothing more than to calm her. It was like his body went on autopilot in her presence. He wanted to feel her softness once more, but that wasn't going to happen. Not ever. He ruined everything and wasn't worth forgiving. Nonetheless, he had a job to do. At least he did that right. When it came to saving lives, there was no room for error. Hearts were a different matter, one he hadn't mastered. "It's going to be all right. I've done this before." He reached for her arm to give it a reassuring squeeze, but she stepped away, guarded. "I'm fine." Her voice was as cold as the snow on Hawk's Peak. "Right. Now you'll have to hold on tight." He reached for her, but she didn't move. "Sadie, I know this is—" He wasn't exactly sure how she felt, but by the firm line of her lips, she wasn't pleased. "Difficult," he tried, "but I need you to hold on." What he really meant was, I need to hold on to you, because that's all he wanted at that moment. Upon seeing her again after so many years, old feelings stirred anew in his chest, but he wasn't brave enough to speak those words, despite his training as a firefighter. The countless burning buildings he'd rushed into, the vehicles he'd unwrapped from around telephone poles, not to mention kittens he'd pulled from trees. He grinned at the firefighter inside joke. But he had rescued several cats from HVAC vents and basement crawl spaces, even though it wasn't in his job description, strictly speaking. She let out an irritated breath. Fine. She gingerly wrapped her arms around his neck. The warmth of her against him drew up days in the lodge after a few runs down the slopes, winter nights, and the past. They'd shared so much. He laced his hand around her waist and resisted the urge to squeeze. To let this be anything more than a routine rescue. He gave the belaying rope a tug and hollered, "Ready to come up." The slack on the rope went taut, and Sadie tightened her grip on the red elastic of his suspenders. Her knuckles were white. He felt the warmth of her other palm on his waist. They'd always fit together so perfectly. A more solid grip would be preferred. I don't want my drawers to drop. In the past, he'd joked with her anytime she felt nervous, on particularly difficult slopes, when she had a job interview, and when she was feeling stuck. Ironic, she'd actually been stuck in the elevator when she was the most free-spirited person he knew. Her hand shifted to his opposite shoulder. Her cinnamon scent teased his senses. He took a steadying breath. She squeezed her eyes closed as they slowly ascended. He wanted to kiss each of her lids, assuring her things would be okay. Instead, he said, "Don't worry, Sadie. I won't let you go." Her green eyes flashed open. "Tripp, you already did let me go 3 years ago." The words were an arrow to his heart. He lived with regret and guilt every single day. The hint of a possibility crept from his chest to his mind just then. Perhaps he could fix things, but just as quickly it dissolved into the darkness of the elevator shaft. They were both silent the rest of the way up. His team had set up in the hall of the floor with the least number of guests. His father had built the resort empire on discretion, providing guests with the highest level of service possible, and a kind of harmony that was unique and envied by other resort owners. He knew it was vital to maintain that. Even though the resort was operated by a board of trustees his father selected before his death, it seemed they followed operations to the letter. The last thing they needed was bad press. He and his brothers had done enough damage. After taking off the harness, a paramedic whisked Sadie away. Tripp crossed the hall to the large window overlooking the surrounding mountain range, his family's legacy. When the impossible happened, his father, Charles Hawkins Jr., got in a ski accident on one of the private slopes on the backside of the mountain, the one his father, 4 brothers, and he had run countless times. Sadie remained with him, supported him, and helped him through the dark days when they'd hoped his father would wake up. She remained strong for him during the darker days when the possibility of his survival became dire. She was by his side through it all, his days of sadness, frustration, anger, and grief. The mountains around them gave his family life, and took it. He gritted his teeth and tried not to think about what it would mean to take his father's place in the position of authority and power, running the resort. Fighting fires and saving lives seemed more straightforward, easier in a way. It was a matter of survival, whereas filling his father's duties was more complicated. He couldn't trust himself with it. Tripp picked up a clipboard and started filling out the necessary paperwork and filing with the hotel. He struggled to focus. His gaze drifted from the papers to the scene out the window to Sadie across the hall. She still had the ability to make him feel all mushy inside instead of muscular. As he wrote the date on the report, he recalled Valentine's Day 3 years previous. The arrow in his heart drove deeper, stung more. 3 years later, she was somehow 3 times more attractive, but she didn't want anything to do with him. His stupid, foolish, rebellious heart. Then again, it was her rebellious, free-spirited nature that he'd adored. She was always up for an adventure, wasn't afraid to be silly, and her laugh was like wildfire, something that spread through a room and lit up even the grouchiest faces. He heard it now, and like a moth to a flame, it drew him over. The paramedic closed her toolkit and gave him a nod before heading for the exit. It was just the two of them, framed by the window overlooking the town, the place that held their history. A voice inside whispered, maybe their future too. He shook it off because that wouldn't be fair to her. He'd done enough damage. He couldn't give in to the sudden awakening of his desire for her. On behalf of Hawkins's enterprise, I apologize about the elevator situation. She huffed. She wasn't going to make it easy for him. Can I see that you get a complimentary night's stay? She crossed her arms in front of her chest. I told you, I'm not a guest. Right. I forgot. I didn't know you were back in town. Her phone beeped with several rapid dings. I didn't know you never left. I thought your sights were set on skiing in Europe. Backpacking around the South Pacific and other faraway locations. He recalled her daydreams of seeing the world. He could have made that happen if only he'd had more courage. With marriage came a lot more than just a wedding day and their happily ever after. It came with money, a lot of it, as well as the responsibility to carry on his father's legacy as chief of the resort. It was a surprise that none of his brothers had married yet. Perhaps they were all afraid they'd screw it up too. She jutted her chin defiantly. I left, but I came back. From the other end of the hall, a tall, blond man in a suit strode toward them. Do you work here? Tripp asked her. None of your business. He recalled her being sassy when she wanted to, but rarely was it directed at him. Though, considering past and present circumstances, he shouldn't have been surprised. The man in the suit spoke to one of his crew members who was putting away the rescue gear. Tripp had been gone so long he wasn't sure if it was a resort employee or... A bolt of fear zinged through him. Was the guy Sadie's boyfriend? He was dapper, had trim hair and a strong jaw without the shadow of scruff Tripp often let grow on his face during long shifts at the fire hall. I'm sorry, Tripp said to Sadie in a low voice. About what? Again, her tone was as frosty as the snow-covered pines dotting the village. The past, the present, both? She grunted. Can I make it up to you? Meet me for dinner at the Hawk and Whistle after my shift, unless... It had been their favorite place to grab food. Before. They had a history that he wasn't sure she wanted to revisit. If that was the case, in the very least he owed her closure. The guy in the suit's eyebrows lifted when he spotted Sadie. She didn't so much smile, more like bristled. Maybe Tripp stood a chance, or perhaps she directed the prickly body language at him. If you change your mind, I'll be there at 7. He scrubbed his hand down his face as she bustled down the long hallway with the man in the suit. Chapter 3. Sadie. Every day after Sadie dragged herself out of bed, she dropped to the cold wooden floor and onto her knees for her morning prayers. That particular day, she lamented not being more specific. She hadn't asked God to help her keep her job. Michael rattled on about the website snafu. She hadn't mentioned anything about elevator safety. Her knees still wobbled. And nothing was said about keeping Tripp Hawkins out of her life. She thought they'd already dealt with that. She had a single prayer in her heart, and it didn't have to do with herself. Despite this, she said a quick word of gratitude that she was no longer locked in the elevator. Although, as Michael's voice rattled back to her, it might have been preferable to facing her boss. We need your access codes to fix the faulty web redirect, Morgan said, if you think this is some kind of joke. She cut him off and said, I don't even know what the problem is. Morgan, Sadie's boss, a tall and athletic woman, made even taller by the black stilettos strapped to her feet, loomed over them after they rounded a corner, You don't know what the problem is, Sadie? I tasked you with a single purpose. Customize the couple's packages based on the feedback from past years and add new and creative ways to cater to our guests this Valentine's Day. She intoned each word as though scolding a toddler. I was locked, Sadie started. No more excuses. In the elevator. Morgan interrupted as she held up a tablet. What I want to know is this your idea of a joke? The screen displayed a dating website with Sadie's name and profile. The photograph was the same one from the employee directory taken when she'd started working there over a year ago. Her hair was frazzled because it had been one of the worst weeks of her life. If I were going to look for love, I would have used a better picture. The dark circles under her eyes and the drawn expression on her face reminded her why she was desperate enough to apply for a job at the resort. Sadie, everyone here knows you're not the most reliable and have a tendency to wander off into la-la land during the workday, but this is going too far. We all know how desperate you are after being dumped, but... Her throat was thick. Since she'd been back in Hawk Ridge Hollow, she'd managed to sidestep most of the inquiries. Of course, everyone knew, but most had the sense not to throw it in her face. Most people in town were decent folks. She knew what was coming next as Morgan wound up. She was desperate, but not for love. This profile isn't mine. I've never seen it before. Sadie Collins, female, age 30, eye color green, hair red, Morgan sing-songed. It's strawberry blonde, but I'm telling you, I didn't create that. Let's go to my office. I'll show you the guest packages and pages intended for the website. Morgan went on to read the incriminating dating website profile titled Looking for Love This Valentine's Day, in which Sadie, or someone impersonating her, lamented not having a date for the upcoming holiday and requested any eligible bachelors to look her up at the resort. This is unprofessional, unacceptable, and Sadie stood her ground. It's not mine. Chattering voices and laughter filtered down the hall, and the group of firemen and rescue workers approached. Sadie's stomach fluttered. Her nerves were fried. A standoff in the hallway with her boss and her ex after being stuck in an elevator all afternoon was too much. She almost wished she'd stayed in the Italian Alps with the people she'd met while backpacking. It didn't matter that they'd hardly understood each other. The food was delicious and the laughter plentiful. Instead, the unforeseen had happened, summoning her home. Sadie, I've given you chance after chance, Morgan said sternly. Her cheeks heated, even though she begged them not to reveal her discomfort. Why would I have a dating profile? Why would I link it to the resort website? Morgan's mouth puckered. Because you're single. Danielle appeared over Morgan's shoulder. The last thing Sadie wanted was her boss's assistant, poking her pointy nose into this already embarrassing situation. No, the last thing she wanted was for Tripp to overhear the details of the situation. Once again, she felt stuck. Because you're lonely, Danielle said loudly. Sadie sensed the mockery in her voice. Danielle routinely gushed about her boyfriend and how he spoiled her. Only Michael didn't say a word either way, even though she knew he soaked up the drama. I'm not looking to date because, Sadie said, taking her final stand. She'd just tell the truth. No, she's with me. There was that familiar voice again. Tripp Hawkins took off his firefighter's hat and flashed a charming smile. But it was cut with something else and directed at her boss. Possession? Warning? Sadie wasn't sure. However, the surprised expressions on Morgan, Danielle, and Michael's faces indicated they knew exactly who he was and the power he held. Apparently, he didn't own the resort yet, but everyone in Hawk Ridge Hollow knew his father's last request, or command, as it were, in order for his sons to receive their inheritance and shares in the resort, mountain, and their various holdings, making each of the Hawkins men wealthy beyond imagination. They had to marry. Sadie knew the stipulation all too well. Tripp discreetly squeezed her hand. Ice and fire shot through her arm, battling with what she once knew and the present situation. Danielle's eyes shot to the motion, and she pursed her lips. At least for the moment, the blaze won. It rushed through her at his touch, and the suggestion in his words, kindling something inside her. Relief quickly washed in next, because above all, she needed to keep her job. Tripp was broad and brawny, like all the Hawkins men. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, but the dusting of scruff along his chiseled jawline suggested the rigor of his job and long hours. His skin held on to the sunshine of warmer months, even though it was deep winter. She stifled an uneven breath. Apparently, her body remembered exactly how to respond to him. When they were in the elevator, she'd been in such a state of shock, she hadn't been able to think, or feel, or do anything other than hope she'd make it out alive. Against her will, her gaze drifted over him again, and his eyes sparkled like starlight on snow. A rush of warmth blanketed her skin. However, when he turned his attention back to Morgan and Danielle, they were flat, dark. There was a command in them. "We're keeping it quiet, and I request you do the same." Sadie stood a little taller. "Can we fix this computer error now?" she asked her boss. Morgan nodded and moved toward the elevator. "I'll meet you upstairs." Before she could thank Tripp for bailing her out or yell at him for lying, he'd already gotten on a different elevator with his team. She took the emergency staircase. After spending the next several hours fixing the erroneous redirect on the website and publishing the correct couples' packages, Sadie tried to take down the fake dating profile. Obviously, she didn't have the username or password, so she resorted to emailing the company, claiming someone had stolen her identity. Nonetheless, she could hardly focus after the ordeal, but also after seeing Tripp. It had only been 3 years, but it felt like a lifetime ago. So much had changed. He was as much a gentleman as ever, and he still had the ability to turn her stomach topsy-turvy. Or perhaps that was the after effects of a life-threatening situation. She wasn't sure she'd ever step foot on an elevator again. Then those dreaded words echoed in her mind as they had so often. "It's not you, it's me." Then, "But we can still be friends, right?" The reminder made her reinforce her armor. She would not soften, wouldn't melt under Tripp Hawkins's smolder. It had been Valentine's Day. She thought he was going to pop the question. They'd even looked at rings together. Then he'd said the impossible, done the unexpected. She left and didn't look back until she heard an altogether different set of dreadful words. A nurse had called from the local hospital, and she'd never been more terrified in her life. She took the next available flight home. Sadie closed her eyes, pushing away the pain of the memories. When she opened them, the sun had long since set, and the lights along the ski trails lit up the mountain, forming organized lines. Meanwhile, her life felt like it had been thrown into chaos. It was time for her to go home. Who cared if there was a fake dating profile with her stats? She'd fix it the next day. After Sadie trudged back to the house and checked to make sure everything was okay, she found herself pacing. Her stomach grumbled, and she didn't want any of the frozen meals she dutifully prepared each Sunday to have on hand for the week. She wanted French fries with cheese, or nachos, or something hot and delicious, melty and fried. She also wanted to tell Tripp everything she'd rehearsed during her long, lonely nights. At least Danielle had been right about her being lonely. As she pulled on her boots, she told herself not to leave the house. As she made sure her phone was charged and on regular non-airplane mode, she gritted her teeth. As the cold winter night stung her cheeks, she pushed her shoulders back. She was going to give Tripp Hawkins a piece of her mind, and definitely not her heart. It was 7:30 when she stepped foot in the Hawkin whistle. It was always lively, with lots of laughter and filled with the smell of chowder and bannock, a kind of fried bread that the restaurant sprinkled with cinnamon and sugar in the morning, topped with cheese in the evening, and brought to your table, whether you asked for it or not. Going there, though technically she couldn't afford it, was one upside to moving back home. Although it was decorated with a hodgepodge of Valentine's decorations, including a red and pink paper chain she thought she recognized from when she was a little girl, and she and her dad used to pop in for dinner on Fridays. Sadie wanted to escape the holiday, the stress, and the man with the confident smile, the swagger and rugged good looks that had previously made her swoon. She pushed the thought away, over the lake, through the woods, and back to wherever he'd come from. She would not swoon at the sight of him. She wouldn't return his smile. She would cross the room and tell him what she'd been wanting to say for years, and it would feel good to get it off her chest. She'd feel relief, and maybe a little bit of self-satisfaction, knowing she could hurt him as much as he'd hurt her. She came loaded with barbed words and stinging phrases. She was ready to battle. "Sadie, I heard about the elevator. Are you okay?" Kayla rushed over and threw her arms around Sadie. She shuffled back, semi-relieved her friend had prevented her from making a total scene. They'd become friends when Sadie returned to Hawk Ridge Hollow and was looking for a job. Kayla was a ski coach during the day, worked at the restaurant part-time in the evenings, and was a wedding photographer on the weekends. She said she had a shoe-buying habit that she couldn't afford on one income and was the kind of person who couldn't sit behind a desk. Her cousin worked in the offices and had connected Sadie with the job. "It was a fiasco, but I'm fine. Thanks for asking." She gave her the quick version of the ordeal, then also went on to tell her quickly about the situation and the fake dating profile. All the while she felt her eyes drifting to Tripp every few seconds, who was in conversation with a guy they both used to be friends with. "Is that him?" Kayla asked. "Is who him?" Sadie said vaguely. "The one you never got over." "I certainly did get over him." Sadie crossed her arms in front of her chest. "You're giving him major heart eyes right now, and he's giving them back. I'd say you're far from over him." Sadie put her hands on her hips. "I'm not giving him heart eyes, but I am going to go over and give him a piece of my mind." "Mm-hmm," Kayla said with an air of disbelief as Sadie stalked away. Chapter 4. Tripp. As Sadie walked over with her hair brushed back over her shoulders and her fists clenched as though prepared for war, Tripp's old friend excused himself. "Probably best to leave you lovebirds to sort it out," he chuckled. Before Tripp could ask what Bobby had meant, or defend himself, Sadie stood as tall as her petite frame would allow as she planted herself opposite him at the table for two. She wore a heavy coat and scarf, warm boots, and her hair was slightly crazed from the hat tucked in her pocket. He recognized the stripes, the colors of the local hockey team, the one he and his brothers played for at various times when they were growing up. "I have 3 things to say, Tripp Hawkins." "Would you like to take a seat?" He made to get up to pull out the chair. She held her ground and shook her head. "First, thank you for rescuing me in the elevator." She was in battle mode, and there was nothing soft or appreciative about the sentiment. Just doing my job, he said mildly, crossing his arms in front of his chest. It was fitting he brace himself, but he wasn't feeling particularly defensive. He deserved whatever was coming, probably worse, but he'd done a decent job punishing himself as well. Second, even though I didn't ask for your help, thank you for stepping in with my boss. I didn't realize you worked at the resort. You swore you never would. You didn't want to be saddled down in an office. You wanted to see the world. Things change, Tripp. Fair enough. Except for the gaping hole that was Sadie and his brothers, his life actually hadn't changed much. He was a creature of habit, and he found he missed the spirit of spontaneity she brought to situations. When they were together, she'd sometimes surprise him with day trips to do unique places like bowling, visiting the ranch, or volunteering to help people less fortunate than they were. Did you get everything sorted out with your boss? It sounded like a mess. He easily could have inquired at the resort, but he didn't want to pry into her personal business, though he was curious what had happened. When he'd stepped in, he risked getting her into more hot water if she did, in fact, have a boyfriend. He thanked his lucky stars that didn't seem to be the case, though he did want her to be happy. It was a stupid dating site. I didn't put my information up there or redirect the resort couples' package registration to it. I don't have time to date, and I wouldn't... She didn't finish. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on played on her features. He took a long sip of water before asking her the question that burned on his tongue. So you don't have a boyfriend? That's not relevant, and I'm not going to go on with the charade that you're my fake boyfriend. He raised his eyebrows. But again, thank you. You being my former boyfriend is number 3. He recognized the fire in her eyes and the way her temper flared. He'd expected her to let him have it, but years previous. Instead, she'd vanished, and he'd taken a job in the city. In truth, he'd avoided what he knew he deserved. However, he feared it then more than ever, because she'd let it build up for so long she might erupt like a volcano. The song, playing in the background, changed, and in the pause, her stomach grumbled. Let me buy you dinner. I'm not hungry. Her cheeks flushed. She must have been steaming hot in her coat. His lips quirked. Your stomach. I'm not hangry either, if that's what you're implying. She finished the sentence for him. They knew each other so well. And the look of amusement on your face is making me angrier. At least sit down and let me have it. I know I deserve it. Really, he just wanted to be in her company, even if it was under less than ideal circumstances. Though it was a step up from finding her trapped in an elevator. You deserve every bit of it. She threw off her coat and sat down anyway. She took a long sip of his water and opened her mouth, ready to fire, when the server came over. Hi, Sadie. Do you want to introduce me to your date? She winked. Kayla, we both know this is not my date. Sadie narrowed her eyes and pursed her lips irritably. If you must know, this is Tripp Hawkins. She smiled. You're sitting at the lovebirds' table, and that makes this a date. She pointed at a thick paper cutout of 2 birds sitting atop a heart on the wall next to the table. At the top, it said, Love Birds Forever. We move the poster around every night. It's luck of the draw, but whoever sits here gets a free appetizer. So what'll it be? At the same time, Tripp and Sadie said, Jalapeno poppers. They exchanged a glance that made his smile grow and wiped away the worst degrees of her scowl. Coming right up, Kayla said. They both reached for the glass of water, and their hands brushed. Sadie jerked hers away. In the dim light of the restaurant, Tripp could have sworn he'd seen a spark. If not, he definitely felt it, and he'd felt plenty of sparks. Heat at up to 300 degrees. downed wires with electricity dancing in the rain. The spark he felt just then brought something alive in his chest that he'd forced dormant. "I'll bring you 2 lovebirds more water. In the meantime, behave yourselves." Kayla gave them both a curious, or perhaps knowing glance, and disappeared through the swinging doors to the kitchen. "As you were saying?" Tripp wasn't looking forward to her tirade, but better to get it over with. He saw now that he owed that much to her, because he certainly hadn't forgiven himself for what he'd done. Sadie sat a little taller in her chair. "Let's go back, shall we? It was Valentine's Day, 3 years ago. Everything, to my knowledge, was going well. We were a happy couple. I saw no indication that you were unhappy. In fact, we'd just celebrated your birthday. I recall it being enjoyable. We talked about the future. We even picked out names for our potential children. Dylan and Delaney." Her expression softened for a fraction of a second. "Yes, I'd arranged a special date for us on Valentine's Day. I thought—" Her voice broke off, and she glanced away. However, he could still see, no, feel, the sting in her eyes. He recalled all too well how she'd recoiled in shock when he'd broken off their relationship of 5 years, how she silently fell apart and then walked out of his life for what he thought was forever. She glared. "You'd said, 'It's not you, it's me.' I should have said, 'You're right, it was you, and you're going to be the one missing out. In fact, I hope it was the biggest mistake of your life.'" "I was young, immature, and scared," he admitted. "It was the biggest mistake of my life." Yet Sadie didn't relent. "Then you asked me if we can still be friends. No, friends don't treat each other like that, making you the worst kind of person. At the very least, you owed me an explanation, but didn't even give me that." "You didn't let me. I wanted to stay friends, explain everything to you. You rushed off." She harumphed. "Oh, and the last thing you'd said, that I only recalled earlier today, was you mentioned that I deserved better. I certainly did deserve better than you." Tears pierced her eyes. He hated that he was the source of them. "You could have just told me you'd met someone else, or you were no longer in love with me. Anything to keep me from wondering and doubting myself. Instead, I got silence for 3 years. Well, now that you know how I feel, you'll get my silence." She moved to leave the table, but he reached for her hand. Her skin was soft, but tension crackled beneath it. "I told you, this time, I won't let you go." He wasn't lying. He had been young, immature. He'd experienced a series of personal losses. He couldn't bear to have her leave him too, so he'd let her go first. Then he poured himself into his job. It gave him purpose. But Sadie was like sunshine, warming him through, infusing him with an altogether different sense of resolve. To see her face light up, to be in her glow, there was no one like her. Chapter 5. Sadie. Sadie had long since pushed all her feelings aside, deep down or out of sight, out of mind. By not getting sidetracked by her emotions, she'd made it so she could forge ahead. It proved easier and more efficient than letting life overwhelm her or stress her out. But Tripp's hand, holding hers, ignited something within she couldn't ignore. Finally saying what she'd wanted to say all that time didn't light the fuse in her heart. Not even his apology struck the match to bring it back to life. No, it was the claim he made with that simple gesture. Those 5 powerful words were the ignition, a promise. "I won't let you go." They smoked out the anger, the confusion, the bitterness. They blew away the sadness, the sense of betrayal and abandonment. She hid her hands in her lap, thinking, processing, trying to understand the multitude of emotions crying out, lighting up, demanding her attention. The food had arrived, but she didn't dare touch Tripp's hands again. not even for the blessing. She folded her palms together and expressed her gratitude before helping herself to a jalapeno popper. The heat was strong on her tongue, but she wouldn't let herself fall back into his arms so easily. "Did you want to order your meals now?" Kayla asked after checking on a nearby table. Sadie felt as if she were pulled from a trance. She felt his eyes locked on hers, as though waiting for a response. "I won't let you go." She shook her head, snapping herself out of it. "Yeah, I'll take a salad and hawk fries, extra cheese." "That's my girl." Kayla jotted it down on the order pad. "I'll have the nachos," Tripp said. "They're big enough for 2 people." "I've seen him eat 2 plates full," Sadie said, recalling a time when he and his brothers competed for who could be the biggest pigs. Only they claimed it was a test of endurance. "I thought we'd share," he said with a smile. "Our nachos are the best," Kayla added. "Be back in a jiffy." The new Tripp shares his nachos? "If you're remembering the time She cut him off. "I'd rather not remember any of it." "That was the old me. Let me explain." She rolled her eyes. "Please?" "Please? Well, since you're using your manners, why not?" she said, not dulling the sarcasm in her words with a smile. He popped a jalapeno in his mouth. "The new you is spicy. I like it." "Spicy-er," she corrected. Tripp squared himself and leaned toward Sadie. "Listen, I can only imagine how difficult I made your life when I broke things off." "Difficult? More like miserable." "You know that in order for me to receive my inheritance, I had to marry." "I think everyone in Hawkridge Hollow knows that. What with the women leaving their boyfriends and lining up at your door, hopeful for a proposal?" Sadie scoffed. She was surprised not to see a ring on his finger, or perhaps he'd already divorced. "I didn't want you to think I was only marrying you because it would give me access to the money." "It did occur to me after the fact, but we were together. Why would I think that? I thought you knew me better." "Wait, unless you think I just stayed with you because, then if you had billions, I could make you buy me things, take me to fancy places and—" Danielle's stories about her boyfriend flashed through Sadie's mind. Tripp held up his hands. "Sadie, I know you're not that kind of woman. No, it's more complicated, layered. We were so young when we met." "You were my first and only real boyfriend." Tripp's eyebrows shot up. "You weren't kidding when you said you weren't dating." "You're so full of yourself. Of course I've dated, but—" She shook her head and wasn't about to tell him no one else ever measured up. "Go on, finish what you were saying." "I was afraid I'd keep you from all your dreams of travel, backpacking." "Those were our dreams. At least I thought they were." "I was afraid I'd hold you back." "You can out-hike, out-ski, out-everything me. What do you mean, hold me back?" Tripp studied his hands and took a breath that caused his toned chest to strain even more against his thermal shirt. "The inheritance isn't only money. It's responsibility. I thought I was mature back then, old-fashioned, responsible, not wild like my brothers." "So, you wanted your freedom?" "Yes, but—" "You're right. You weren't mature. We could have talked about this. Of course I wanted a family, but getting married doesn't mean we'd have to settle down immediately. We could have traveled and then bought a house, had kids. Why didn't you just tell me?" "I was afraid." "Of what? I don't understand." Tripp leaned closer. "I was afraid to fill my father's shoes. The inheritance came with his rules, but it also came with his role. It means I'd be in charge." "But your brothers all had the same stipulation, right?" "Yes, and do you see any of them with a ring around their finger?" "You're All avoiding marriage because you're afraid of following in your father's footsteps? She hadn't seen any of them lately, in fact. Tripp's shrug was so subtle she almost missed it. Sadie shook her head. No, I don't buy it. The Hawkins brothers are fearless. They're the strongest men I've ever met. Well, I guess I've never met Blake, but all the same. That's the point. We're men. Human. And I'm sorry. Tripp leaned back in his chair and raked his hand through his dark hair. Now you know, I'm not as strong as you thought. Sadie shook her head again and locked her eyes on his. No, Tripp, you're stronger. Even though I don't completely understand, I respect that you finally had the guts to tell me the truth. Thank you. He looked around, dumbfounded. It took more courage than I thought I had. But really? Apology accepted. It felt good to say it, a relief, even if underneath she wasn't quite certain if she fully meant it. Okay, well, great. So, after everything that happened, where'd you go anyway? He stumbled over the words as though not sure how to break the ice. I went to Australia. As far away from me as you could get. Sadie almost smiled. Yup, then Italy. She told him about the backpackers she'd befriended. So, can we be friends? Tripp asked. No, we cannot. The words were tart. She could forgive, but not forget, and friendship would require that. I thought you'd accepted my apology. I'll let you know if I change my mind, but friends don't do things like that to each other. Fair enough, I suppose. His eyebrows crowded together. She started to get up again, but their food arrived. Now you two lovebirds enjoy, Kayla said. Sadie rolled her eyes, but stayed put. Over the course of the meal, he told her about working at the fire hall in the city. He went on to ask about her travels, and she told him a few more stories about her time abroad, keeping it civil. When they'd both had their fill, and they'd declined the dessert menu, Tripp said, You know, this seems like this is something friends would do. Sit, eat, chat. Kayla practically forced us. You wouldn't let me leave. She recalled the burn of his hand gripping hers, and the way his words seared into her mind, leaving her with a sizzling feeling, melting away the frostiness surrounding her heart, the armor she wore to protect herself. Tripp smiled his infuriatingly charming, smug, and devastating smile. It melted a bit more. I have to go home. But she didn't truly want to. Part of her hated that fact because it made her feel selfish. But the night had been one for truths. If she was honest with herself, she was tired. She worked full-time and was a caretaker. It was a lot. Plus, it was warm and lively at the Hawk and Whistle, a contrast to the sadness that lingered throughout her crumbling down home. Houses took a beating from the weather each winter in Hawk Ridge Hollow, and they didn't have the money to hire out repairs. There, she was lonely, even though she wasn't alone. Depressed, even though she was grateful for each passing day. She'd counted her blessings just as they silently counted down the days until the inevitable. It tore her up inside, devastating her. If we can't be friends, are you officially single? Tripp yanked her from her thoughts. Caught off guard, she said, Yes. Then she snapped to attention. You have a scheming face. You know me well. I thought I did. Turns out I didn't at all. He glanced away as though stung, and toward all the Valentine's decorations. She watched him closely. Obnoxiously, his lips turned up. Now you're smiling. Why? You'll find out. His grin was wide then. I'm really leaving this time. She pulled her hat low on her head. Can I bring you home? Not tonight, but thank you. Let me walk you to your car. He stood and left several bills and a generous tip on the table, like the gentleman he always was. How about to the door? She pointed. Fair enough. I'll take what I can get, for now. What's that supposed to mean? You'll find out. She didn't have the energy to probe him. It had been a long day. Sadie said goodbye to Kayla, and her friend made a kissing face behind Tripp's back as he grabbed a mint. Sadie shook her head. Mark my words, Kayla whispered. You didn't say anything. Mark my lips. She winked. He has a brother, right? Sadie held up 4 fingers. Ooh la la, I like the odds. She knew her friend was joking and stifled a laugh despite the circumstances. Sadie and Tripp stepped into the cold night. The air was crisp and the stars clear. Thanks for dinner and your honesty. Sadie stepped to leave, but slipped on a hidden piece of ice. Tripp gripped her arm. Whoa there. She glanced up at him. Thanks. Of course. In his clear eyes, she saw his lasting apology. Or maybe she felt it. She glanced down at his hand, still holding her in place. Their breath clouded as they lingered in front of the restaurant. A car's lights beamed over them and pulled into the lot, jarring them from the moment. Oh, right. Have a good night, Sadie said. Tripp remained under the lamplight as she glanced over her shoulder and walked away. The warmth from his eyes, from his touch, and the promise not to let her go kept her from shivering on the walk home. The honesty in his apology and confession filled her heart, but doubt was like a fog in her mind, preventing her from trusting any of it. The next day, Sadie huffed and puffed as she walked up the flights of stairs to her office. She vowed not to be late and factored in the additional time since she refused to take the elevator. When she reached the office, a large bouquet covered her desk. It was outrageous, with red, white, and pink flowers, roses and tulips, peonies and ranunculus. Sparkly sprigs in silver accented the arrangement. From your boyfriend, Danielle? Sadie asked her boss's assistant. She grunted. Bunny? Michael breezed by. No, they're for you. Seems you have a secret admirer. You looked at the card? He passed it to her. She turned it over. Dear Sadie, no flower is as beautiful as you. Love, your secret admirer. Warmth brushed across her cheeks. Her heart felt both buoyant and rebellious. Buoyant at the sweet gesture. It had been so long since anyone had done something so thoughtful. Rebellious because the message her mind gave her, it wasn't real. It wouldn't last. She'd be left broken again. There was only one person who knew peonies were her favorite, and they were hard to come by that far north in February. She remembered when Tripp had surprised her with a bouquet for no reason, a random Monday, after a long day, just because. But she wasn't going to go back to him after her humiliation, after his betrayal, after she'd finally let the past go. But perhaps it was a coincidence. There was also an assortment of other flowers. They could have been from anyone. She couldn't imagine who else, though. Certainly not Michael, and hopefully not anyone from the dreadful dating website. She opened her email and was thankful to see a response to her inquiry about the fake account. They deleted it after she provided a few additional pieces of information. Even though she was used to pushing her emotions away, she couldn't stop thinking about the night before. She felt an unexpected sense of peace, like she'd finally set down baggage she didn't even realize she'd carried. As usual, she went home for lunch. All was well, for the time being. She arrived back at the office just before the town bells rang and stood outside the office door, catching her breath from climbing all the stairs. The rise and fall of voices came from the other side. Busy in meetings all morning, Morgan hadn't been in, and Sadie hadn't spoken to her since the previous day. She braced herself for her boss's wrath. Instead, Danielle and another woman spoke in semi-hushed voices. Notably, she heard her name. "The money, of course," Danielle said. "Have you seen her house?" "They were at the Hawk and Whistle last night." "I doubt they're really dating. I bet she's using him." Danielle's voice rasped. Sadie's stomach plunged. "Well, I'll be exposing her, and maybe winning him for myself." Her coworker wheezed a laugh, but she didn't hear the rest of what they may have said, because from behind, Morgan cleared her throat sharply. "You're not paid to eavesdrop, Miss Collins," her boss warned. Chapter 6. Tripp. Tripp hardly had a chance to think about the meal shared with Sadie at the Hawk and Whistle because the fire hall received a call shortly after midnight to assist a neighboring crew. It was arduous, focused work as they fought a chimney fire that had spread rapidly. However, before he fully rested his bone-tired body on the cot in the dormitory, he found himself recalling how he'd gummed up the courage to apologize and told Sadie the truth. He'd bared it all. He no longer feared she'd reject him because of his shortcomings. He'd already done the wicked deed himself. It took him a long time to realize he'd pushed her away because he was afraid she'd tell him to get lost if he was anything other than the strong man she'd always known. As the evening in the pub had worn on, he was pleased they'd made progress and even moved on to talking about their lives. Although he sensed she left some details out. She was as beautiful and bright as ever, but she seemed preoccupied, like something weighed on her. He wished he knew. He was strong, physically of course, but he'd endured a lot of loss with his family. Too bad he didn't realize it back then, before it was too late. He could help her, if only she'd open up. Then again, Sadie said they couldn't be friends, so it shouldn't have been a surprise to him that she kept some things to herself. But considering she didn't have a boyfriend and wasn't dating, that didn't mean they couldn't be something more. An idea grew boldly in his mind, kindled by hope. He resolved to try to win her back. There were still several days until Valentine's Day, the anniversary of when he'd ruined everything 3 years before. He was going to make it up to her. As he drifted toward sleep, the plan, inspired the night before, fully came together. Inspired, he jumped from the cot and grabbed his phone, placing a quick order and hoping it would arrive at the resort ahead of her. Later that day, after Tripp's shift at the fire hall, he wandered into the quaint village. Aside from his visit to the Hawk and Whistle the night before, he hadn't stepped foot on the cobbled streets for several years. Mostly because he'd been avoiding the questioning stares caused by the gossip that was sure to have spread after his breakup with Sadie. The donut shop on the corner still boasted the best and only donuts in town. The lights from the bookstore glowed softly. The ski apparel and souvenir shops modestly advertised sales on gear and handcrafted items. Even though Tripp loathed to admit it because he preferred a life of humility, the Hawkins brothers were like local royalty. His great-grandfather was a pioneer and staked claim to the mountain, lake, and surrounding valley. He called it Hawk Ridge Hollow, in part because of their last name, but also because of the birds nesting nearby. Years later, his grandfather opened a small lodge at the foot of the mountain after what started as friends and family visiting to ski and enjoy winter sports became a steady stream of people asking to use the mountain for recreation. After that, Tripp's father built the empire comprised of the hotel, much of the village, and the ski resort. He developed it on their homeland and farther afield, creating a network of winter-related enterprises that brought in a previously unforeseen amount of money. The family had a certain reputation for their rugged and entrepreneurial spirit alike. Their credibility came from how well they ran their businesses, employed locals, treated everyone from workers to guests with fairness and kindness. Plus, all 5 of the brothers were raised on the slopes. They'd all even skied for the national team, and Owen medaled at the Olympics. Of course, in their own ways, they'd gone on to experience success, but he wasn't sure they were happy. In fact, he hadn't spoken to any of his brothers in a few years, since shortly after his father's untimely death and breakup with Sadie. The fact that they'd become estranged crushed Tripp, but he knew the various losses caused them all pain in their own ways. Not much had changed in town, but he supposed he had. He found himself in front of Mom and Lollipop's candy shop, a place he and his brothers visited with money they'd earned from chores. Jars filled with jelly beans, gummy bears, and hard candies lined one wall. A display with handmade chocolates on the other, a garland of hearts hung in the window. Like with the inheritance, their father believed money had to be earned. The boys had to work for their loot, but that didn't mean Tripp couldn't spoil Sadie. As he entered the candy store, a rush of sweet confection met his nose, along with the mouth-watering scent of chocolate. Mom, as she was known to the locals, the owner's hair was as white as ever, her cheeks just as rosy, but she was decidedly rounder than Tripp remembered. She tilted her head. "Tripp Hawkins, is that you?" He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." As he approached the counter, her gaze lifted because of his height. "As I live and breathe, it's been ages since you were in here. If anyone ever tells me candy'll stunt your growth, I'd like them to have a look at you. You and your brothers used to clean me out." She laughed. "Can I get you a peppermint snowball or a caramel turtle? I know you loved those." "I came for a Valentine's Day assortment." "Oh." The word fell between them. "For Sadie Collins. You remember her?" "Oh," she repeated, but this time with what sounded like a mixture of surprise and relief. "In that case..." Tripp surveyed the various-sized boxes, from small to large, with a middle-sized one shaped like a heart. "Do you have anything like that, but bigger?" "All you Hawkins boys always did like the biggest, the best. I'll go in the back and see what I can come up with." Moments later, she returned with a heart-shaped box the size of a kitchen sink. "This big enough?" "Sure is. Please fill it up." Meanwhile, he penned a quick note on a complimentary card on the counter and signed it, "Your secret admirer," even though to his mind it was no secret. After accepting a sample of a new maple buttercream pecan candy she was working on, Tripp made his way to the resort. He had full access, so he opted to use a side door and took the stairs up to the corporate offices. He found an unoccupied porter and had him bring the chocolates to Sadie's department. Afterward, he roamed the grounds of the resort, preoccupied with memories, noting several changes and upgrades, and wondering how the board had maintained such a high level of quality and care without his father's keen eye and high expectations. Then again, there had been the issue with the elevator, and he'd heard a report that several chairlifts were down for maintenance. A few guests complained about the restaurant staff, and apparently towels were in short supply. None of that would have been allowed on his father's watch. Mom, from the candy store, was right. The Hawkins men always went for the biggest and best. Tripp sighed as he found himself where he'd started, by the entry close to the stairs. As he opened the door, an enormous bouquet of flowers hit him square in the chest. "Excuse me," Sadie's voice called from the other side. "I'm sorry, didn't see you." She balanced the blooms on top of the box of chocolates. "Secret admirer?" Tripp asked. Her head poked between the bouquet, framing her face. One eyebrow lifted with curiosity, or suspicion. He wasn't sure. She was indisputably adorable. "What are you doing here?" He shrugged. He wasn't sure, actually. She seemed flustered, though. Hopefully, nothing else had gone on in her department. You were asking about these? They're for my Valentine's sweetheart. I'm on my way to see him now. A grin rose to his lips. I thought you were single, but I see you're exiting by the stairs. I prefer them myself. A good source of cardio. You would. After all, you and your brothers were always racing each other, trying to outdo one another. Another reminder of all that had changed, and yet there they were, right where their relationship had started. They'd met at the resort when she and her friends would go there for cocoa. It was his mother's recipe, and possibly the only and best thing she'd left them with before she took off. Another sigh escaped. That was why it was easier to stay away. Next time Rocky challenges you to a race on the ice, you'll win. Or if Dallin tries to wrestle you, you'll finally hold your own. Teasing laced her voice. I always held my own. He counted off the flag football wins, racing on the slopes, and other competitions. Just because I'm the oldest brother doesn't mean I'm an old man. She lifted onto her toes, as though inspecting for gray hairs. But between the flowers and uneven ground with the snow and ice, she started to lose her footing. Tripp reached for her, planting his hand on the small of her back since her arms were full. He thought of the night before, when their hands had brushed, when he'd reached for hers. It was that contact that felt like it slowly brought him back to life, and out from under the glacier he hid beneath, despite his regular and close brushes with fire. She harumphed as he steadied her. The reminder of her smooth curves made his pulse double. His hand heated, shooting flames through his limbs. How are your brothers anyway? Haven't seen much of them. Tripp shrugged. You might say we're estranged. She tucked her head back. I'm awfully sorry to hear that. Yeah, me too. Anyway, it looks like you have to get those to your Valentine's sweetheart. Wouldn't want them to freeze in this cold. She started walking, but struggled to move forward on a straight path on account of the large load in her arms. Tripp swooped in and took them from her hands. Let me carry those to your car. Fine, and thank you. Tripp gave her a quick sidelong glance, soaking up the glow on her cheeks, the green in her eyes, and the pink of her lips. They passed the employee parking lot, but he didn't ask any questions. They continued down the street and took a few turns before he realized they were walking to her house. Maybe she liked the extra exercise too. Not that she needed it. He knew under the coat and warm layers, her body was perfect. Mountains and valleys, sculpted curves and smooth skin. His pulse tripled. That was probably all the cardio he needed. Snow covered the roof of her house, along with the car in the driveway. A narrow path led to the door that looked like squirrels or badgers had carved it. You need someone to plow you out? He asked. She hefted the chocolates and flowers back into her hands. Their hands brushed again, sending warmth blazing through him like an inferno. She hesitated. Maybe she felt it too, but then said, No, we're doing just fine. He could see they were not. They? Her father? Mr. Collins always had a strong sense of homeowner's pride and protection over his daughter. Likely he knew the story of their breakup and wouldn't take a shine to Tripp's presence on his property. But something wasn't right. Nevertheless, he asked, I can bring those inside if you'd like. She shook her head, or more accurately, the flowers shifted left to right and left again. No thanks. Her words were dismissive. He didn't want to push her. The ground between them was fragile enough. If you get hungry later, I'll have a plate of nachos waiting for you at the Hawk and Whistle. She mumbled something from behind the bouquet and walked carefully along the path. Tripp waited for her to get inside before walking back the way he came. It seemed like finances were tight. Maybe something was wrong with the car and she couldn't afford to get it repaired. Her house wasn't far from the resort, so it made sense for her to like to walk unless the weather was bad. However, a storm was predicted to hit in a couple of days, and he didn't like the idea of her walking around in it. He pulled out his phone and made a call, hoping for a favor. He was sure the flowers and chocolates would make her happy, despite what she said about them being for her sweetheart. But he had a more practical way he wanted to make her days a little better. First, he had to get her out of the house and himself in. Chapter 7. Sadie. Sadie had no doubt the flowers and chocolates from her alleged secret admirer were actually from Tripp. But she had to make him know she wasn't so easily won over, and she wasn't available. Even if that weren't true, strictly speaking. He said he was going to be at the Hawk and Whistle for dinner again. She'd go, but not alone. She didn't want to give anyone the wrong idea, but needed to stage a fake sweetheart to show Tripp the extent of her unavailability. She needed someone tall, handsome, rugged, rich. No, she couldn't use any of his brothers. Sadly, that sounded like a situation she didn't want to get in the middle of. Michael from her department popped into mind. He was athletic and a great skier, intelligent, though prone to anxiety. After Danielle flirted with him relentlessly for weeks when he'd started working at the resort, he indicated he wasn't interested in women the way she'd hoped. He was perfect. She sent him a text. He replied with a few questions, mainly about what to wear. A couple of hours later, she found him waiting by the entrance to the pub. "Is this about the website redirect? Because Danielle did not ask me to do it." He slapped his fingers over his mouth. Sadie raised an eyebrow. "Then who did she ask?" "I don't know." "You're too handsome and wholesome to lie, Michael." "You're right. I'm a terrible liar. All I know is she thinks you're fake dating that hot beefcake who owns the resort." "I am, sort of, and his name is Tripp." "Is he single?" "He's in pursuit, I think." The idea both excited her and filled her with dread. Michael grabbed Sadie's sleeve as she entered the pub on a cold gust of air. "Wait, you are fake dating him?" "Shh," Sadie hissed. "It's complicated. At work, I am. Outside the office, absolutely not." Sure enough, he was seated at a table inside, but this time with a couple she recognized from town. Sadie laced her arm through Michael's, making a big show of their entrance. Kayla approached. She took a long look at them, and then her gaze flashed to Tripp. "What is going on?" "We're looking for the Lovebird table. Is it available?" Kayla smirked. "Oh, honey, I made that up. You were both mooning over each other, and I've been doing well on tips, so the poppers were on me." "I don't understand," Michael said. Kayla looked him over, and as perceptive as ever, it appeared she quickly understood what was going on. "Handsome, but no potential here. If you're single, I'd love to introduce you to my friend Erin. Anyway, follow me." She led them across the dining room and seated them at the table next to Tripp. "I was thinking over there, by the window," Sadie hissed. It was in full view of Tripp, but not close enough for him to overhear their conversation. She now had two purposes: make Tripp jealous, but also weed out any information from Michael about Danielle, especially after his slip of the tongue and overhearing the conversation the other day. "I'm sorry, sweetie, that table isn't available." Kayla perched her hand on her hip. "No one's sitting at it," Sadie protested. "Hasn't anyone ever told you not to argue with the waitstaff? We might spit in your food." Kayla lifted an eyebrow. Sadie and Michael recoiled. "I'm kidding, but you're sitting here." "Do you have any dishes with kale?" Michael asked as he took a seat. Sadie shook her head. How about quinoa? Nope. She set a basket of cheesy bannock bread on the table between them. I'll be back with water. Michael glanced at Tripp, who didn't hide his curiosity at the newcomers. Listen, I don't know what you're up to, but just a friendly meal between friends, she whispered. But her eyes were glued to Tripp. She couldn't look away. He'd shaved, for one thing, revealing his chiseled jaw. His eyes were bright in the low light. The muscles of his chest and arms flexed when he shifted, leaned in to say something, or leaned back with laughter. She swallowed. Hard. Was it possible for him to be more ruggedly handsome than earlier that day? The day before? 3 years ago? As though sensing her staring, Tripp excused himself from the couple at his table and turned to Sadie and Michael. They're out of guacamole. The nachos aren't the same without it. Okay, she said. When she didn't make introductions, he turned to Michael. We haven't met. Tripp extended his hand. I'm Tripp Hawkins. His hand was noticeably larger and firmer than Sadie's dining companion. Is he your Valentine's Day sweetheart? Michael gulped. Do you mean is she my Valentine's Day sweetheart? No, my date is with a tub of Chubby Hubby ice cream and season 4 of Fixer Upper. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Hawkins. I'd better get going. He stood up to leave. Tripp barely suppressed a grin. You can call me Tripp, and it's nice to meet someone who appreciates home design. I prefer interiors, but those two are genius. I agree with you there. Are you leaving Sadie so soon? Someone excitedly called to Tripp from the entry, and he turned to greet them. Michael leaned into Sadie and hissed, I don't put up with rich people's ridiculous requests all day to be your fake date. I thought he was your fake boyfriend. He's big enough to crush me. Despite how attractive he is, I'd certainly mind. Now, I need me some Chip and Joanna. He wrapped his scarf around his neck. You owe me, Sadie. She winced. I have a box of chocolate almost as big as this table. I'd prefer the flowers, but you need to stop playing games and get honest with him. Michael pointed to Tripp's broad back. I, for one, do not want to be caught in the middle of your fake love triangle, or whatever it is. Also, I cannot understand why you'd object to someone as handsome as him giving you that look. What look? Kayla passed, apparently hearing and seeing everything that went on in the restaurant, and gave Sadie an I told you so face. The look he gave you when we walked in, when we walked over, when we sat down. I was getting dagger eyes, and you were on the receiving end of love heart eyes the size of saucers, or that box of chocolates you mentioned. On second thought, you can bring them to me tomorrow. Michael hurried from the restaurant, and before Sadie could follow, Tripp took his seat. He pressed his palms together. Am I correct in guessing Michael is not your sweetheart? Sadie rolled her eyes, and then held her hands in the air between them. Whatever you're trying to do, stop. Tripp took the outsides of her hands between his and pressed them together. Warmth immediately raced through her fingers and arms, pooling in her chest before burying itself deep in her belly, waking up the flutters of excitement that only Tripp Hawkins had ever been able to cause. Cold hands, he said. His voice was a low rumble that she recalled all too well. It filled her with the memories of desire. Cold feet. He tilted his head in question. Here? She did like foot rubs, but that's not what she meant. You walked out. I thought you accepted my apology yesterday. Forgave me. She did, but she didn't want to get too close. Her heart was fragile enough. Tripp, I can't do this. Kayla was there with her order pad, as if on cue to keep Sadie put. What can't you do? Order dinner? Let me help. We have a few specials. Although we're out of guacamole, the cook came up with this brilliant idea for Irish nachos. Homemade potato chips topped with... Sadie interrupted Kayla before she rattled on because she didn't want to lose her train of thought. I'll take that. Make it 2, Tripp added. When Sadie turned her gaze back to him, her train of thought had left the station. Instead, she got lost in his eyes, the way they sparkled and crinkled around the edges, as though he were gazing at something both rare and beautiful. His lips quirked in a mischievous way and then turned up into a grin. Tripp, don't look at me like that. Kayla and Michael were right about the love heart eyes. Like what? He asked, feigning innocence. Like you like what you see? I do like what I see. I said I forgave you, but I can't go through this with you. Go through what? His lips quirked. I don't want you to think there might ever be something more between us. It pained her to say it, but she already felt like she was playing with fire. The last time she did, she was burned. She'd promised herself never again. Tripp leaned back in his chair. You can't blame a guy for trying. So, you're going to stop trying? She asked. Relief and disappointment rolled through her belly like choppy waves at sea. He shrugged. At least let's have dinner and allow me to bring you home. After that, I won't ask you to meet me here again. What about the gifts at work? I thought those were for your sweetheart. Very funny. She hadn't liked pushing the truth. It would only cause a mess, but she didn't want to give him the wrong idea, and he was as stubborn as ever. Actually, aren't they from your secret admirer? He asked. How'd you know? Lucky guess, but I know almost everything that goes on at the resort. You basically said you didn't want anything to do with it. Too much responsibility and all that. I'm reconsidering. Doesn't that mean you have to get married? Yes, I do. The words sounded like a dare, like a challenge, like a promise. Just then, Kayla brought them both heaping plates of Irish nachos, topped with sour cream and olives. Sadie tried to probe Tripp about what he meant, but he steered the conversation to her. She tried to direct it back to him, but he volleyed it into her court. They went back and forth like this until the conversation took on a natural flow, and they talked about everything from the mud run the resort was going to host the following summer, the kinds of dogs they liked, and an animal adoption organization Sadie had heard about. Once more, Tripp footed the bill. Thank you, but this doesn't mean we were on a date. Is it still okay for me to bring you home? He asked as they stepped outside and into the chilly night. Despite being bundled up, Sadie hopped on her toes. Sure. The truck warmed almost instantly. Enclosed in the vehicle cabin, she picked up his familiar scent, wood smoke, and the fresh, clean shot of soap she'd get and always loved so much after she'd nestled into him. The smell carried her back in time to memories. Them skiing at night under the stars, warming up afterwards in the lodge, closed to the public, but still serving the resort's famous hot cocoa. She always piled hers high with marshmallows. The kisses he'd plant on her lips, warming them through. You know, things really are different now. Yeah, he answered vaguely, as though lost in his own thoughts. I never expected to work at the resort. What's your pay? He interjected. Huh? Never mind, he said, as though realizing his faux pas. I just want to make sure you're compensated fairly. Some days it's not worth the aggravation with my boss. She'd wanted her assistant to get the promotion, but HR gave it to me. Danielle is hardly qualified, but the two have held it against me for the last year. Sadie wondered, since Danielle was actually trying to prove she and Tripp weren't really together, if she was also capable of sabotaging her couples' package project by redirecting the site to a singles website profile, as Michael indicated. Tripp grunted. The healthcare package is fantastic. You can include a family member if they reside with you. Tripp parked on the street near her house. Even though they weren't on a date, and she wasn't going to let things go farther, being with him reminded her of better times, when everyone was happy and healthy. His sparkling gaze met hers, and he reached to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "Sadie, you look sad." She shook her head and swept her fingers under her eyes. "I'm not at all. Remembering happy times." "We had some, huh?" His smile was wide. The two spent the next hours reminiscing. If it had been a warm summer's night, their laughter would have echoed off the sides of the surrounding mountains. Stars sparkled overhead, crisp in the night sky. "You always did know how to chase my blues away," Sadie said after glancing at the clock. Something had softened between them. It was too bad they couldn't create new memories to go with the olds. "I'd better head in," she sighed. They'd turned to face each other while they were talking, and their knees touched. Sadie knew the moment she shifted, the spell would lift. Her heart would harden, and she'd go back to facing reality. She parted her lips. "Thanks again for the meal, and..." She waggled her finger between them. "This. I hadn't laughed like that in a while." "It's like music to my ears. I always did like making you laugh, smile." Sadie felt herself sliding toward Tripp, as though down a mountain. She couldn't stop herself. He moved closer too. She felt his breath on her cool cheeks, warming her through in the way only he ever could. Her eyes dipped to her lips. Hers lifted to his. Excited anticipation rose up inside, casting away the doubts, the trepidation, the worry. They were only a heartbeat away from each other. She'd always known he was the one. No one had ever made her feel so adored. A chunk of falling snow, dropping from the corner of the house's roof, caught her eye, and she startled. Then she sat back before thrusting herself toward the dash and windshield of Tripp's truck. "Where's my car?" It hardly ran. Why would someone steal it? Maybe her father took off. But why? How? A large hand rested on top of hers, holding her fast. She didn't want him to let go, but she had to make sure her father was all right if he was still there. What had he been thinking? "Tripp, I have to go." Chapter 8. Tripp. "Sadie, wait." Tripp held onto her hand, as much of a lifeline for him as it seemed to be for her. They'd connected, sitting there in the truck for the last minutes. Hours? He'd lost track of time. She spun in the seat. "You don't understand." "Let me explain. I had Austin's tow and plow shovel it out. They're making repairs. It'll be back before you leave for work in the morning." "They're not open at night. Their prices are..." Tripp shook his head. "I want to make sure the girl I'd like to be my Valentine's Day sweetheart has a safe vehicle to drive." She paled, but ignored the comment. "How'd they start it?" "I guess you left the spare key at the shop when you went in for an estimate. He'd been meaning to give it back to you." "You didn't go inside?" "Break into your house? No." She leaned back on the seat, apparently relieved. He also arranged to have the driveway plowed, the path to the door cleared, and would have a few cords of wood delivered, though he hadn't made that call yet. "You didn't have to go through all that trouble." "It wasn't trouble. I'm happy to help." "I'm fine, Tripp." "You've said that a few times, but the Sadie Collins I knew and loved was better than fine." He said it, and he'd meant it. She now carried a burden, keeping her from the free spirit he knew still dwelled inside her. He saw glimpses when she'd smile, laugh, or get caught up in conversation and forget the walls she'd erected. Nonetheless, she stiffened at the word love. "Thanks for helping me out. The car, clearing the snow." "Don't forget the wood." "Good night, Tripp." Her fingers hesitated on the door handle. She turned back to him. He leaned a fraction closer, certainly interested in picking up where they'd left off before she noticed the car missing. He should have warned her, but he wanted it to be a surprise. which was why he'd parked on the other side of the house where the driveway was mostly out of sight. She tucked her chin and then got out of the truck. "Good night, Sadie," he called softly after her. He had an overnight at the fire hall, which meant he couldn't go through with Phase 3 of his plan until after lunch the following day. He knew the flowers and chocolates were more of a woman's love language than clearing snow and car repairs, but Sadie was from Hawk Ridge Hollow. Like most people there, she had a certain amount of rustic know-how and practicality. A necessity when the mountains were steep and the winters long. But the town also had a certain elegant charm. It drew an elite clientele, and that had somehow shaped the population as well. Sadie and the residents were down home and upscale in many ways. Still, she wasn't open to trying again with him. His third tactic would require more planning. Seeing as it was almost Valentine's Day, he put in for time off from the fire hall, something he'd never done in 12 years of employment, except for during his father's accident. Plus, he had some research of his own to do. He wasn't joking about getting married, not because he no longer wanted to be a fireman, and it meant new responsibilities. He did, and would be as long as he was able. And not because he wanted the money. He was thrifty and had plenty of savings and investments. No, he wanted to make Sadie his missus, to have and to hold, for better or worse, through everything and always. Tripp's finger hovered over the call button on his phone. It was difficult, and he had to get over his stubborn nature, but he was the oldest brother. Someone needed to take the first step toward reconciliation, even if he was just ordering a few cords of wood. Not surprisingly, Rocky didn't answer. He left a voicemail message, asking for a delivery of wood to Sadie's address. He'd also been in town long enough for the usual gossip to reach his ears. He heard murmurings about Sadie's father. Then, to his surprise, he received a call from Mr. Collins himself. After Tripp's shift and a nap, he grabbed a couple of donuts from the shop in town, then took a familiar route, hoping his unannounced visit wasn't at a bad time. Although the unexpected message said he was welcome to stop by any time during the workday, except for the lunch hour. The key was still under the mat. It took some doing getting it up since it was ice-encrusted. Although an hour later, Tripp had learned that even though Hawk Ridge Hollow looked much the same, so much had truly changed. In his 3-year absence, Sadie had traveled as she'd always wanted, but he understood what brought her back, what caused the weight she carried upon her shoulders, and the reason she so carefully guarded her heart. Her father was ill. Tripp, of all people, understood the loss and devastation she was experiencing. It was a slow and painful slide, watching someone you care for decline, though his father's demise had been fast. He scrubbed his hand down his face before putting the truck in drive and thought of his dad, helpless, in a coma. Mr. Collins was still coherent, but struggled with things Tripp had previously taken for granted. Things as simple as opening the door. A distant uncle had Parkinson's, and although Tripp knew it wasn't fatal, it was debilitating, and the later stages often required round-the-clock care and could lead to complications. Sadie mentioned the resort offered great health care, but he'd have to look into options. Feeling slightly melancholy at the reminder of her losing the man she knew as her father, and his own loss, he waited in the lobby of the resort, hoping to intercept her. Instead, a tall woman with a pointy nose and bright red lipstick approached, wearing clicking heels. He hoped she had a change of shoes before heading outdoors. It was slippery and uneven, despite the care the grounds crew took to ensure guests' safety. She stopped squarely in front of him. "Tripp Hawkins," she said, extending a slender hand. "It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. I heard you were back in town, heating things up." Her eyes drifted over him from head to foot. She was lean, angular, and reminded him slightly of his mother. So preoccupied with being thin, she missed out on the delicious side of life, like chocolate and nachos.
Back in town? Yes. Heating things up? He shrugged. I'm not so sure about that.
Well, if you ever get chilly, you know where to find me.
Who are you? He asked.
His eyebrows bunched together. He was no stranger to women coming on to him, but his heart belonged to a girl who knew to change into boots when heading onto the cobbled streets of town. Though perhaps this woman wasn't leaving and had merely spotted him. I'm Danielle Hogan, assistant to Morgan Bryce in guest programs and packages. Tripp recalled Sadie mentioning something about a problem in her department with a website. I know all about arranging couples' Valentine's Day packages. They're meant for people like us. She fluttered her eyelashes. Then he recalled the encounter in the hallway after he rescued Sadie from the elevator. Danielle accused her of being lonely, and he'd stepped in, saying they were a couple. Someone had connected a singles dating website with Sadie's profile to the couples package button. He quickly put two and two together and discreetly brushed his hand over his pocket.
Do you really? I'd tried to purchase one in case I had a special someone on the big day, but it brought me to a bad link.
Danielle snorted a self-satisfied laugh. You're not dating Sadie. I knew it. A man like you is too good for a short little imp like her. She narrowed her eyes. Anger blazed through Tripp, but he kept it in check, eager to get the info he needed. Were you just helping her save face?
I guess you could call us old friends, he said, goading Danielle along.
He'd grown up with brothers and had been witness to plenty of drama. He had a feeling something was amiss, given Danielle's apparent dislike for Sadie, and what she'd mentioned about getting the position over the assistant, and rightfully so. He scoffed.
I can't help but wonder who'd set up that fake dating profile, because...
He spoke slowly, leading her along. She grinned. It's not that hard. I just used her photo from the company website. She's so flaky she didn't even realize it.
Wow. Did your boss know?
Of course. We've had it in for her from the beginning. Until now, we haven't had anything strong enough to get her fired. But I bet you could move things along. I want her position. Tripp's jaw tightened, and he felt his blood boiling. His father never would have tolerated these kinds of people in his employ.
You interrupted me, but I was going to say that I can't help but wonder who'd set up that fake dating profile, because they should be fired.
Danielle's face fell. What do you mean? It was just a joke. Harmless, really. Wait, who do you mean should be fired? Sadie, right? She's always late from her lunch break. Her expression passed from coy to frightened.
I meant you and Morgan, your boss. I'll be talking to HR. You can pack up your things.
Her arms whipped across her chest and she jutted a hip. Tripp, you don't have the authority to fire me. You have to marry to get your share of the company. Everyone knows that. However, I happen to be available. It could be one of those arrangements of convenience. No one would even have to know about this conversation. His mouth dropped open. She was relentless and absurd. The reason his father put the stipulation in his will was because he wanted his sons to experience love. She was cold-hearted, a snake.
Oh, everyone will know.
Then, over Danielle's shoulder, his eyes met Sadie's as she changed into her high heels and put her boots in a shoulder bag. She stumbled when she saw Danielle leaning in and droning on about how she was single, how they could make it work, how she didn't mean any harm. But he also knew that it might look like something else was going on entirely. Things were fragile enough between them, and he didn't want to make it worse. He moved to follow Sadie as she stormed across the lobby, but Danielle blocked him. He pulled out his phone, tapped to make a call, and sidestepped her, rushing after the girl he wanted to be his sweetheart. Chapter 9. Sadie. Sadie's insides had frosted over like the lake at the foot of the mountain. She'd tried to ignore the doubts fogging her mind about how Tripp wasn't true. She pushed away the worry that he was just looking for someone to hook up with, or rope into marrying him. Of course, Danielle would smell that a mile away and sink her talons in him. But he wasn't innocent either. He'd said he was going to marry. Maybe he meant the first eligible woman willing to be his bride. Danielle would certainly ditch her boyfriend and volunteer. She'd had enough difficulty and humiliation for a lifetime. Although her father had seemed unusually content when she'd gone home for lunch, she held on to threads of gratitude, lifted her head high, and strode through the lobby. Sadie wasn't going to warm to Tripp because of flowers and chocolates. She wasn't going to roll over and let Danielle take her job. Her father relied on her, and she wouldn't live with regret if she got distracted by a guy, or that she could have done more to support him. Her dad had been a single father and worked hard her whole life to provide, put her through college, and even helped her on her travels. Above all, he wanted Sadie to be happy. The least she could do was see to it he was comfortable and taken care of. "Sadie," Tripp called. "Sadie." Unlike Michael the other day when he was trying to be discreet about the website snafu, Tripp didn't lower his voice so as to not cause a scene. Nonetheless, she ignored him. However, he finally caught up to her in front of the bank of elevators.
"I thought you took the stairs now."
She'd been so preoccupied with avoiding him and processing her anger, she'd walked to the elevator on autopilot. Right. She strode toward the stairwell.
"Can we talk? It's not what it looked like. If it looked like anything."
"It looked like you two were getting close. I can't help but wonder if somehow the two of you have it in for me. You want to humiliate me. First with the fake dating profile, then by saying you're dating me. This is probably some kind of ruse. As if breaking it off on Valentine's Day wasn't enough." She walked on.
"Sadie, now you're just being paranoid. But yes, that's kind of what happened. I mean, no. Just stop for a minute. Hear what I have to say."
"Since I obviously can't call security and have you removed from the property, go ahead, talk, but I might not listen." Tripp shifted from foot to foot. Sadie mounted the stairs. "I have less than 5 minutes to get to my desk. Otherwise, I'll hear it from my boss. I think she'd already like to have me fired. The clock is ticking." He took them two at a time after her.
"If you're thinking Danielle was coming on to me, yes. But I let her because she was revealing information about you. Or, more accurately, how she created the fake dating profile and sabotaged your couples' package program. She even said Morgan knew."
Sadie slowed, having reached the 5th floor. "Really?"
"Yes. Whatever went on in your imagination, I think that's what Danielle angled for, to be honest. She mentioned us getting together, but you know me better than that. I'm your secret admirer, your knight in snowy armor, rescuing you from iced-in cars and the cold."
Sadie's chin trembled. "Did Danielle tell you what happened this morning?" Part of her wanted him to gather her up in his arms, but she kept her distance. He shook his head. "All my documents were wiped from the department file share. Morgan set up a meeting with HR because she accused me of not doing my work."
"Well, she no longer works here, so you have nothing to worry about. I can't promise you her position, but—"
"You can't prove they created the dating profile and falsified the link?"
"I'm on call today." Tripp lifted the radio from his pocket and jiggled it. "Everything transmitted through this gets recorded. There's a hard copy at the fire hall."
Hope rose in Sadie, but it had sharp edges. She wasn't going to lose her job. Even though Morgan and Danielle were arguably diabolical, she didn't want them to lose their jobs either.
"My father is probably rolling over in his grave," Tripp said. "Maybe this place hasn't changed much in appearance, but it needs some TLC."
Sadie prickled as she opened the door to her floor.
She didn't want to think about anyone's father's demise. Hers was all she had left. He'd never allow this kind of backstabbing. Tripp went on to describe her co-workers using colorful language. She reached the glass door leading to her office. Tripp gripped her shoulders. Their eyes met. She recalled the night before in the truck, how close they'd come. "I never want anyone to hurt you," says the guy who hurt me the worst. But her voice was small, because although that was true, he was making it up to her now. He'd made a mistake, but causing her pain wasn't his intention. Avoiding his own was. One of the greatest virtues she knew was forgiveness. If she said she forgave him, she really had to do it, not just say as much. She closed her eyes, said a little prayer for courage. A kind of calm came over her, smoothing the furrows in her brow and cascading all the way to her toes like a warm wave. When she parted her lashes, he gazed at her with such intensity a smile grew on her lips. She recognized the love hearts in his sparkly eyes. The moment was short-lived, as Morgan strode down the hall with a glare and a glower. "Now, as we let HR handle your former coworkers, as the future owner of this place, I'd like a tour, an insider's perspective." With a firm hand on the small of her back that sent tingles up her spine, he turned her back toward the stairs. She was glad to avoid the wrath of Morgan, something she knew all too well. Tripp explained the quick call he put into human resources as he'd raced after her in the lobby. He couldn't fire them, but HR wasn't going to ignore his request either. Plus, he had dirt on that pair, and the guys at the fire hall were sure to send the recording over. Back in the lobby, Sadie paused in front of the chocolate fountain. "Tripp, you know this place inside and out." She was going to dig into that box of chocolate later that night, and a comedy movie that took place in some distant land. The day was already too long and too bizarre for her to deal with. She needed an escape. "Things change," Tripp said, pulling her back to the present. She started walking again, not really sure where to go or what to do. Even though her boss and her assistant hated her, at least during office hours, she knew her role. This was uncertain terrain. "It's not an efficient use of resources to pay me to show you around." "You're worth every cent." His strong arm slung around her shoulder, and he pulled her close as they ducked down a rarely used hallway. Her arm laced around his waist, once more as if she were on autopilot. He was quite a bit taller, and she fit perfectly under his arm, like a wing, protective and caring. Countless times they'd walked through the lobby, town, and farther afield like this. Then again, the territory they now traversed was like one of her travels in a way. Tripp paused by an alcove. "I want to know more about what you do. Start with the couple's getaway packages." She felt herself shifting into work mode, even though it wasn't her dream job. The reason she loved traveling so much was the experience new places provided. It brought her joy to know people who'd never traveled to their corner of the world had a memorable time. Taking part in creating memories for those who returned season after season was fulfilling. "I help with all the specials the resort runs year-round. Obviously, with Valentine's Day around the corner." "Tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken." "Correct." She'd gone to work at the beginning of the week, wishing the day away, but now she wasn't sure what she wanted. Her thoughts became fuzzy as the space closed between them. "Sadie." It wasn't a question, but felt like one. "Tripp," she said. His eyes danced over hers, then shifted to her lips. She lifted onto her toes. He gripped her jaw, drawing her nearer. The scent of wood smoke and soap flooded her senses. The press of his chest against hers was all-consuming. The connection transported her, took her away from her troubles and to a time when life had been uncomplicated, and they'd been free. She felt the tension leave her body, even as her pulse thundered.
It was as though the brush of his lips against hers tapped out an ancient code, revitalizing her, igniting her. He paused and drew away, but not too far so he could meet her eyes, full contact. Yes. Tripp bit his lip, and then moved to meet hers. His mouth was soft yet demanding, manly yet affectionate. She filled with light then as they kissed, with joy, with relief. It felt the same as she'd remembered, but better. They'd changed. His scent tapped into her memory, yet there was something new there too. Mint, perhaps? She wanted to take a bath in it, rub it over her skin, never forget the smell, this feeling. The sensation of his lips against hers traveled straight to her heart as his hands twined in her hair, as she gripped his broad shoulders, as the scruff on his jaw brushed against her skin. The kiss deepened and then was over all too soon when a chorus of laughter echoed down the hallway. They could get away with things like that when they were younger, but now that Tripp moved toward leadership, she knew it was better for guests and employees not to spot them making out. She also didn't want to jeopardize her job more than it already had been. For the next few hours, they toured the grounds, but she couldn't ignore the delightful heat on her lips, the quick pulse in her veins, or the promise that there might be more. He asked questions about her role, her ideal couples' package, and what worked well at the resort, and what they could improve. She did her best to focus, but she felt young again, free, alive. By the time she got home, she was practically walking on clouds, or driving, rather, now that she had her car back. "Dad, I'm home," she called. He rarely answered, embarrassed because of his difficulty speaking. They'd made a silent agreement after his diagnosis and decline. No one would know that the once mighty Lance Collins couldn't do the simplest things, string a set of words together without stuttering, feed himself without making a mess, be the father his daughter needed. She didn't want to hide, but it seemed as though that's what he preferred. She honored his desire. "I'm in here," he replied. She entered the living room and found him on the sofa. He rarely got out of bed. "You're home, and you're glowing," her dad said. The tone in his voice reminded her of years before when he was still healthy. She tilted her head. It was as though he'd opened a window and let fresh air in, although it smelled distinctly like wood smoke. Perhaps she imagined things, was too hopeful. Perhaps she was wrong about him wanting to live in secrecy. Sadie's hand reached her cheek. She still felt pink from their stolen kiss, and the others Tripp snuck when no one was looking. One on her cheek, one on her forehead, and a polite but warm one on the lips when she left for the day. Just then, someone knocked on the door. Chapter 10. Tripp. Tripp knocked on the door and could feel the warmth from within escaping. It had been a while since Mr. Collins had been able to tend to the house, and likely most other matters. He wanted to help, and he would, but first he had to win Sadie back. She pulled open the door and her breath caught. "Tripp, what are you doing here?" The rosy hue to her cheeks disappeared, and she paled. She started to step outside, but her father called, "What a surprise! We have company. Let the young man in." "Dad, it's fine. I'll see him later," she said over her shoulder. "Nonsense. Open the door, invite our guest in, then close it quickly. You're letting the heat out." Tripp smelled the wood stove burning and hoped they'd been able to afford to have the chimney swept. Lord knew he'd seen the result of neglecting that chore. But he didn't expect Mr. Collins or Sadie to climb onto the roof. The wallpaper peeled, and the carpet was more worn than he recalled. He doubted they had the resources for upkeep of any sort, but it was clean and tidy. "I see you got your wood delivery," he said as Sadie stepped aside to let him in. "Ah, yes, thanks to Rocky." Tripp cleared his throat, relieved his brother dropped off the logs. "Thanks, Tripp," Sadie said in a small voice.
"You mean Rip Van Winkle?" Mr. Collins asked.
Both Tripp and Sadie stared at him with their eyebrows knitted together. He brought a shaky hand to his chin. "Dad, this is Tripp. You remember him, right?" The corners of her eyes pinched with concern, and likely she worried he was getting forgetful too. He waved his hand dismissively and then rested it on his walker.
"Yes, Tripp, with the flowers and chocolates. Rip Van Winkle with the wood."
Tripp smiled, immediately understanding. "Rip Van what?" Sadie asked.
"It's a character from an old story. My grandfather used to tease Old Man Bruce up on the mountain pass about his beard." "Do you mean my brother Rocky grew a beard?" Tripp asked Mr. Collins. "Yes, I watched him stack it. Wish I could have helped. Make myself useful. But do you mean you don't know if your own brother has facial hair?"
It took him a while to get the words out, but Mr. Collins was as sharp as ever.
"Unfortunately, we haven't spoken in a while, sir."
He shook his head solemnly. Sadie cast her dad a sympathetic look with a tilt of her head.
"That beard was so bushy I imagine squirrels have a nest in there."
Mr. Collins laughed.
"The same ones that carved the path to your front door?"
Tripp asked, joking. Mr. Collins cracked a smile. "It was heavy snow. I did the best I could," Sadie said defensively.
"Of course you did, dear. Tripp, thank you for helping us out." "I'll never be able to repay you for your kindness, so the thanks goes to you."
Tripp nodded politely. Mr. Collins's smile grew. Sadie spotted a shiny coin on the table. Her father had been an avid coin collector, silver dollars in particular.
"The shining star to my collection. Charles Jr., Tripp's father, said he'd bring it down to me, in exchange for its value, of course, but tragedy struck."
Tripp had balanced his elbows on his knees and looked down. He supposed Mr. Collins faced his own sort of tragedy now, Sadie too. But it had been a surprise when her father contacted him earlier, asking about the coin and if he cared to pay a visit. "How'd you get that, Dad?" Sadie asked, as sharp as her father.
"Tripp brought it over this morning. We talked about old times and let bygones be bygones."
"You both went behind my back and met in secret?"
"I asked him over, dear. Now don't get yourself worked up. My nerves can't handle it."
He wheezed a chuckle.
"You get like this and you're allowed to make cracks like that. Now, you two, what's the plan?"
"The plan?" Sadie asked, seemingly in shock. Tripp supposed even after their kiss, she hadn't thought he'd show up at her house. He realized she'd been hiding the situation from him, and likely everyone in the community. Not that it was a secret, or should have been. Word in Hawk Ridge Hollow traveled despite the lake and mountain and other obstructions. On Sadie's part, it was likely pride because her father wasn't the picture of strength he once was. Maybe having outsiders witness his decline made it more real for her. He clapped his hands together and lifted his gaze to meet hers.
"Well, I came over because I want to ask you on a date. A Valentine's Day date."
She turned to her dad.
"I already gave him my blessing. I did 3 years ago, and I did again when he paid me a visit while you were working earlier."
Her mouth dropped open. "Dad, you don't have to do this."
"Sadie, nothing would make me happier than seeing you happy. Nothing would make me happier than seeing you healthy. By that, I mean with a healthy heart, filled with love."
Her eyes misted over.
"Sadie girl, we both know what's coming. It's no use hiding it or denying it. I don't want my last memories to be only of these 4 walls. I want to see my girl get married atop the mountain to the man she loves and who loves her."
Silent tears tracked down her cheeks, and Tripp had to admit his eyes felt watery too. She threw her arms around her father's neck. When she pulled away, she said, "Dad, he only asked me on a date." Her dad nodded.
I wish you both all the happiness in the world."
Sadie wiped her eyes and choked back more tears, then let out laughter. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves. They spent the next hour chatting, and Tripp stayed for dinner. He tried to convince them both that it would be in everyone's best interest to have her and Mr. Collins stay at the resort for a month or so, get round-the-clock care. Sadie would be in the building, so nearby all day long. That way, the house could be repaired without them living in a construction zone.
"Does my stay include room service? Massages? I never did take advantage of all the fancy amenities offered over there," Mr. Collins said.
"Dad," Sadie scolded.
"I'm joking."
"That's very generous of you, Tripp. We'll have to think about it."
"Offer stands, anytime. Consider it a donation to a family who deserves it, or a perk of your dedication to your work at the Hawk Ridge Hollow Resort."
It sounded like she needed convincing, but he felt confident he could do it. Sadie wrung her hands together, and he took them in his. Feeling the sensation that being close to her brought, the heat, the pulse, the connection, he hadn't been able to stop thinking about their afternoon together, their kiss, and how it seemed like everything was going to work out better than he could have planned, hoped, or dreamed. "This is a lot, Tripp. I don't know."
"Earlier today, you described your perfect couple's getaway. Let me treat you tomorrow, on Valentine's Day." "You deserve a little pampering, dear," Mr. Collins said.
She flashed a quick look at her father. "I don't really want to get away."
"But you always had the travel bug."
"I still do, but there's something to be said about being home." He agreed. It felt good to be back home. Despite the difficult memories, there were good ones too, namely with her, and he hoped many more to come.
"What I had in mind gives us the best of both worlds. We live in a resort town. We don't have to go far. In fact, we can walk. Though now that your car is fixed, it's less than a 5-minute drive. I'll arrange for a nurse to check in on your father."
Mr. Collins nodded.
"I appreciate everything you do for me, Sadie, but it's a lot on your shoulders. You don't have to do it alone."
"Dad, we can't afford—"
Tripp held up his finger. "Consider it part of the date."
Sadie folded her hands in front of her chest. "We can't accept that. It's too much." Her father straightened as best he could.
"Dear, I'm not saying you don't do a wonderful job, but we can and we will accept Tripp's generosity."
His voice was clear, final. She shifted, slightly taken aback, but then a smile started to blossom on her face. It seemed a bit of the old Mr. Collins was back. Tripp smirked, feeling warm all over in her joyous glow.
"Sadie, will you be my official Valentine's Day date?"
Chapter 11. Sadie. Of course, Sadie said yes. She probably repeated it 100 times while she jumped up and down hugging Tripp. Her father's eyes were glassy. Even though she couldn't do much to help him, if seeing her happy made him happy, she'd do it. And being with Tripp ignited a flame inside she'd all but let go out. After his visit, she got ready for bed, but laid awake, replaying the afternoon and evening, thinking about what it might mean to open her heart to him again. It came with a risk. She didn't want to get burned. But she'd been shut off for so long, the steady beating in her chest felt like encouragement. Like if she and her heart joined forces and were careful, things might turn out okay. But then her mind started to churn out doubts and all the ways it could go wrong. It reminded her of the past and all her suffering. She felt caught between head and chest, mind and heart. When she finally started to feel sleepy and drift, she resolved to proceed with caution and go through with the date. It couldn't hurt worse than it had 3 years ago. The next morning, she found herself primping as she got ready. It took what seemed like ages to select the right outfit. Her favorite pair of jeans that hugged her curves and her cutest sweater. It was soft and light pink and perfect for Valentine's Day. She managed to wrangle her curls into something presentable and then added a little extra eyeshadow and mascara to make her eyes pop. As she applied lip gloss with a hint of sparkle, she somehow still felt the warmth of Tripp's lips on hers from when they'd kissed. The way he approached tentatively, asking with his eyes. First, there was the soft brush as his lips met hers, and then, as though assured, the kiss steadily grew in intensity. She hoped her desire for him was clear in her answer as she returned the kiss. Her memory was vivid. His hands on her jawline, moving to her hair, her neck, her back. Beneath her own fingertips, she felt his strength, the density of his muscles and the warmth of his skin. They'd kissed countless times in the past, but this felt new, different, yet very much the same. She realized that even though she'd felt betrayed and hurt, she'd always loved him. That kind of flame was eternal. She knew whatever was to come for them, having loved him, made it all worth it. She couldn't imagine a life without that kind of intense care for another person. Despite the past, she wouldn't trade it because never having loved would have left her feeling empty. With the echo of love and affection still in her heart, she felt full. She finished getting ready, made sure her father was set up with the nurse for the day, and set out to meet Tripp at the resort. Snowflakes fell slowly from the gray sky, drifting down. Tripp told her to go to the resort spa first thing. Typically, the couple's package arranged services for both guests, so she surveyed the area for him. However, he was nowhere to be seen. Her heart dipped. Maybe it wasn't to be after all. The corners of her lips dropped. She inquired with the receptionist behind the desk and then gave her name. The woman smiled as though pleased and said, "Excellent. We have a special morning planned for you." She invited Sadie to a private room for a massage, courtesy of her Valentine. It also included a deluxe maple sugar full-body exfoliation treatment, followed by a wrap. Then she got a facial and her nails done in sparkly pink. Lastly, they redid her hair and makeup. Sadie had never been pampered like that in her life. She was the person who created packages like that for guests to enjoy, not for herself. But she couldn't help but bask in how luxurious it felt, how relaxed her muscles became, how smooth her skin, and how she felt like she glowed from the inside out. After she got dressed, which took her an inordinately long time, she felt so blissed out. One of the spa technicians passed her a note. Assuming it was from Tripp, her heart lifted. Then her mind cast doubt, worried he was canceling. "Dear Sadie, what does a hawk call his Valentine?" She bit her lip to keep from smiling too big. Tripp always did know how to make her laugh. She thought of the lovebirds table at the Hawk and Whistle, but wasn't sure about the punchline to the joke. She flipped the card to see if there was more. His tweetheart, XO, Tripp. She wandered out of the spa and into the hall, not sure if and where they were supposed to meet. She was getting hungry, though. She exited the nearest door, needing to get fresh air and wake up. Perhaps he waited outside. She stood in front of the Hawk post adjacent to the resort because she had a good view of the surrounding area in case he was somewhere else. It was a general store that used to be the post office well before she was born and had a wall of antique metal boxes filled with treats and supplies. She waited outside the shop for a few minutes, then the owner waved her inside. She shivered and hugged her arms as she entered. Mrs. Trilby, who'd been there forever, called, "I was starting to worry you didn't get the message. Tweetheart, birds, hawks, hawk post. Makes some sense, right?" "Huh?" Sadie asked, confused. The storekeeper held up an envelope. "A very handsome young man left this with me." With chilled fingers, Sadie opened it. "Dear Sadie,
What did the boy squirrel say to the girl squirrel on Valentine's Day? She turned the card over. I'm nuts about you. XO Tripp. Sadie giggled. Mrs. Trilby beamed a grin. Well, I don't know. He left me another joke. She showed the older woman both cards. I like a man with a sense of humor. It sounds like a scavenger hunt to me. Either he wants you to go to my backyard and chase those critters away, or maybe you're meant to meet him at the candied nuts cart at the foot of the mountain. She winked. They got rid of that years ago. Mrs. Trilby shrugged. Can't blame an old woman for her hunch. Sadie had always loved getting a pouch of warm candied nuts before heading up the chairlift to the top of the mountain. But after someone with an allergy complained, they removed the cart. I suppose I can try. Thank you, Mrs. Trilby. She left the way she came and crossed the central square between the resort and lodge before heading to the lift leading up one of her favorite trails. Past tense. She hadn't skied much in the past few years. As she neared the chairlift, the sweet scent of roasting nuts pulled her forward. Just outside the waiting line for skiers to head up, a man with a cart held a sign with her name on it. Beside him was also a large bag. Hi, I'm Sadie Collins. He smiled and passed her another card, much like the first two. Dear Sadie, why do you have me spinning today? She tilted her head in thought before turning the card over. Because I think you're tops. XO Tripp. This time she groaned. It was a super corny joke, but sweet, like the nuts she could no longer resist, they smelled so good. Could I get a bag of those? She asked the man. First, I was instructed to tell you to put this on. He pointed to the large bag. Inside was an assortment of cold weather gear, pants, jacket, hat, gloves in pink with a fun white lacy pattern, perfect for Valentine's Day. At the bottom was a pair of goggles. You can leave your belongings in one of the lockers. He passed her a key. What about my nuts? When you come back. She smiled. A few minutes later, she was warmer than ever, and the vendor passed her a bag of roasted candied nuts. Now what? She asked. He shrugged. She thought about the note. I think he wants me to go up. No skis? I don't think so. She wondered just what Tripp had in store, but she was going to go along with it. She got in line for the lift and munched on the nuts. They were so delicious, she'd popped the last one in her mouth by the time it was her turn to get on. The white blanket of fresh powder sparkled below as she rode up through an avenue of trees laden with snow. It was beautiful scenery, and she lamented not taking advantage of living there more often, or at least stopping every once in a while and appreciating nature. As the lift neared the top, the sky opened. She felt like she was a snow princess in a snow globe. The white flakes drifted down slowly, dancing in the sky. She took a deep breath and then got off the lift. When she stepped away from all the skiers who were eager to hit the slopes, an enormous red heart, painted in the snowbank opposite the chairlift, caught her eye. It had an arrow through it, and just past the tip, Tripp waited beside a snowmobile. He waved, wearing a smirk, likely pleased with himself for being so clever. She rushed up to him and threw her arms around him in a hug. I've had the best morning, and you are the sweetest. Thank you. Seems like the massage and everything else put you in a good mood. He kissed the top of her head. Did you save me any of those nuts? Was I supposed to? He smiled and laughed. No, they were for you, but I hope you're still hungry because we're going to have lunch. He turned to mount the snowmobile. Let's go. They'd rode the trails closed off to regular guests countless times, and she wondered where they were going. There was a lodge with a couple of restaurants, but it was over the ridge, and a different chairlift brought skiers directly to it. She got on behind him, laced her arms around his back, and gripped tight. She took in the scenery as they set off,
along with the happy couples and families skiing. When they passed into the cover of the trees, she rested her cheek against Tripp's back. A smile bloomed on her lips. It was perfect. She wished it could always be this way, a life free from burdens, heartbreak, and difficulty. A short time later, Tripp slowed as they reached a clearing. A square platform was set up in the middle with a table set for two. A canopy covered it, and a few heat lamps surrounded it. Tripp pulled out her chair. "Madam," he said grandly. She sat down and rubbed her hands together, feeling extremely special and taken care of for once. He set 2 covered plates between them and then took his seat. He lit a candle and then reached for her hands. Warmth blazed through, heating her up, and not just physically. Together, they said the blessing over their meal.
"I wanted you to have the Hawk Ridge Hollow Resort Valentine's Day experience, but with my own twist."
"This morning was delightful. Thank you. I didn't know I could feel so taken care of."
"That's my aim, and it's just the beginning, really. Word has gotten out that I'm back, and before I move forward with all of that..."
He paused and took a breath. She sensed he still grappled with what it would mean to step into the role his father left for him. Doubly difficult because he and his brothers weren't on speaking terms.
"Before all that, I thought we'd enjoy a private meal in a beautiful place. As much as I love this town, it seems every time I set foot in a store, restaurant, or the resort, I'm clobbered by people wanting to chat, catch up, and find out where I've been."
"I hope you don't feel like I've clobbered you." His eyes lifted to meet hers.
"No, you're like a breath of fresh air. But I wouldn't mind if you clobbered me anyway."
Then he spread his arms.
"And this is a pretty beautiful setting to take a beautiful woman. It's just us, and that's how I always want it to be."
The word always reached her heart, but her mind wouldn't have it. An argument started in her head about how there was no such thing as always and how she shouldn't trust him. Tripp's low voice, asking about the spa, reined in her attention. Soon she teased him about the corny jokes and asked what was next.
He smirked. "I'll tell you as soon as we're done eating."
She pushed her plate away in answer, because despite her trepidation, she wanted to know what was to come. Chapter 12. Tripp. Tripp and Sadie spent the rest of the afternoon blazing the trails on the mountain, stopping to take in scenic vistas. At one bluff, Tripp called her over to check out a view of the town. He could make out her house and hoped her father was doing all right. He'd arranged everything on short notice. The nurse was from the best agency around and specialized in caring for people with Parkinson's. It would be a great opportunity for them to begin assessing for his long-term care in a setting where he was most comfortable. He wanted to give Sadie and her father the comfort that, at times in his life, he'd taken for granted. When his father was in the accident, they'd called in the best doctors, surgeons, and specialists in the world to consult for his care and recovery. It wasn't enough, but this time he could give someone extra time with his loved ones. It was clear how much Sadie and her dad cared about each other. He wanted to see them enjoy the time they had left together. He hoped it was a long time, and an even longer time for her and himself. With a shake of his head, he returned from the somewhat melancholy thoughts. The antidote was her smile, her laughter.
"One more joke for you. What do you call a very small Valentine?"
She tapped her chin.
"A Valentine," he answered,
pulling her small but perfectly curvaceous frame closer. She giggled. "I have one of my own. What do you call the sweetest, most thoughtful man who made this day so special?"
"I know this one. Your Valentine."
His lips quirked, amused and delighted. Her cheeks tinted rosy and a smile broadened across her lips. His pulse thundered with her so close. He dove in, meeting her mouth with his. They kissed on the mountaintop, and he felt like he was on top of the world. With the softly falling snow blanketing them, the quiet enveloping them, and the warmth between them, he gripped her tighter. He didn't want this to end. She returned with a squeeze, pressing her hands against his back. He felt the connection they shared, despite all the cold weather clothing between them, and hoped she did too. The kiss deepened and slowed, and the rhythm smoothed, as though ironing out the wrinkles of the big emotions that once threatened to ruin them. He felt himself getting lost in her, falling for her, wanting more. He felt himself being carried away, transported, like he was leaving his body and looking down over the picture-perfect scene. He cared about her so much. She was everything he wanted. Perfect, beautiful, caring, forgiving, generous. Not to mention she was hot and making him hotter. With one hand, he unzipped his coat. Her hands plunged between his coat and shirt. His skin pebbled from the cold, but also from her touch. She filled him with such a strong sense of desire. He enfolded his arms around her waist and picked her up so they were eye level. She wrapped her legs around him like a pretzel. Then he spun her around as they continued to kiss, swirling like the snow. She let out a laugh, and then he pecked her on the cheek, nipped the space just under her chin, kissed the spot beneath her ear. The moment was sweet, like the sugar on the nuts she'd eaten on the ride up the chairlift. He'd snuck a bag when he'd arranged for them. The tension he'd carried in his jaw softened as they continued to kiss. Even so, he felt strong, burly and protective over her, but could he handle her heart? The question that would unite them forever. An avalanche of thoughts threatened to crumble on top of him. Then his eyes met hers with assurance. "This is all I want. You, me, laughter." His voice was low, confident and warm all at once. He wrapped his arm around her as they took one last look at the view from the mountaintop. The sun had begun to set, with a dim golden glow hidden behind purple and gray clouds. Despite the joy that welled inside, the color reminded him of a bruise, a wound, the one he'd caused to her heart. Perhaps she'd forgiven him, but did he forgive himself? Everything he'd arranged that day was wonderful, but would he ever be good enough for her, what she deserved? More thoughts butted into the moment, and he realized when he was up so high, feeling so good, there was only one direction left to go, down. He zipped his jacket and banished the frown from his lips. "It'll be dark soon. We should head back." He gave her a kiss on the forehead and worried it might be the last. They got on the snowmobile, but before he started it, he said, "You know that I'm not lazy, but I sure like this life, free from responsibility, urgency, and demands." "Yeah, me too." She'd always been a free spirit, eager to travel and see the world. He wondered if it was to avoid the difficulties in real life. Not that she'd been avoiding them lately, but if they were to marry, he'd get the inheritance and take over as head of the resort and mountain. This would mean he'd have a lot of power, and with that would come things that would call him from her, and what he didn't want to consume his life. Constant responsibility, overseeing the welfare of employees, guests, investors, and beyond. There'd be urgent demands and time when he'd be pulled in other directions, away from Sadie and the happiness he felt when it was just the two of them. As they zipped along the trails, he liked the feel of her fitting to the contours of his body, nestled close, wrapped around his back as she held on tight. However, a voice in his head told him he didn't want that for her, to hamper her free spirit and load her with more of a burden than she already carried. The roar of the snowmobile's engine muted his sigh as they sped down the mountain. Having to focus on maneuvering safely cast all thoughts from his mind, So by the time they returned to the lodge, he'd found his smile and basked in hers. "I haven't had so much fun in a long time," she beamed.
"It's not over."
"More? I should probably head home soon."
"Soon, but not yet, if you'll oblige me."
That nagging voice nudged its way back in. He wanted to give her the fullness of the day, of what he'd planned, in case this was it. He led her to one of the unoccupied resort suites on an upper floor in the main building. After they changed out of their gear and warmed up, he met her in front of a crackling fire. He'd arranged to have a blanket spread and a picnic-style dinner, which was part of the couple's package. But theirs was complete with jalapeno poppers, nachos, and other appetizers he knew she loved, instead of the charcuterie and fancy dishes the resort served. They dug in, and despite the trepidations that he'd had earlier, and the thoughts colliding in his mind, their conversation flowed freely. Afterward, he led her to the balcony. Cold air rushed in. He stepped outside, pulling open the cover of the hot tub.
"Care for a dip?"
A cloud of steam lifted from the warm water. The falling snow dotted Sadie's hair and shoulders. Her cheeks blushed red. He stepped closer, wanting to kiss her once more, to feel the soft brush of her cheek against his, her lips, and the pulse beneath her skin. He felt more for her than he ever had, and yet he fought against the thoughts piercing his mind. She took a step back. "I didn't bring a bathing suit."
"It's in the bathroom to the left."
"Seriously? You thought of everything."
"I tried."
But he hadn't thought about the rush of emotions ranging from joy to fear, from delight to worry, from feeling prepared to move forward to wanting to run for the hills, if only to protect her from the way their lives would change. After putting on trunks, he returned to the hot tub first. Not wasting a moment in the chilly winter air, he got in. Shortly after, she emerged from the suite, wearing a robe. She was modest and probably cold, though he'd definitely seen her in a bathing suit before. She plopped in, but kept a little bit of space between them. Perhaps she sensed the way he felt, had put her guard back up, or felt shy. He'd memorized the curve of her smile, but the one she wore now was strained and didn't reach her eyes. The easy conversation from earlier became stilted, or maybe they were both extra relaxed and tired at the end of the long day. He'd intended for this to be the big moment when he'd undo the mistake of the past. The two of them, outside and free but warm and toast. Together under the stars, or snow, as it turned out, but nonetheless, it was beautiful. She gazed into the distance, then blinked a few times. "I feel like I'm freezing and roasting at the same time."
"Want to get out?" he asked.
She nodded and donned the robe, keeping herself covered before disappearing inside. Maybe she was just cold, and they'd thaw out in front of the fire. Their kiss earlier had been like a sugar rush, better than chocolate and candy, and sweeter than anything he could imagine. However, he sensed something squeezing her heart, his too. Uncertainty about the present, the future. He'd planned on getting them hot cocoa to celebrate after leaving the suite, but like a deflated balloon, he wanted to float back to earlier, when things between them felt happier, easier, more natural. When she finally emerged from the bathroom, her eyes were red, glossy. She nervously twirled a curl around her finger. "Tripp, this is too much. I can't get sidetracked. Your offer was generous, but I have to take care of my father. I can't accept it. I can't trust it. Us." He stiffened, and a wave of fear washed over him. "You're afraid." It almost didn't sound like his own voice, like it came from far away, but it was true, because he felt that way too. She nodded. "Look, we tried again. Thank you. I'll never forget today, but maybe it wasn't meant to be." If he went through with the proposal, It meant he'd inherit his portion of the money and business, a major responsibility, leadership. He thought he was ready. Maybe she was right. Now he had second thoughts. I have to leave. Her voice was distant. He reached for her. She shook her head. We can't do this. Please. You have to let me go. Again, he reached for her hand, but she was already out the door. Tripp found himself speechless and suddenly understood how she'd remained silent when he broke up with her 3 years previous. Shock, disbelief, self-doubt. He told himself he wouldn't let her go again, but that was exactly what he'd done. He stepped onto the balcony and into the cold. He wanted to feel anything other than the deluge of emotion, regret, sadness, and fear about the future. The snow blanketed Hawk Ridge Hollow. It was a town he knew and loved, built by his family from little more than a cabin in the woods. He gripped the rail, then gazed up into the sky. He blinked. He thought he saw a shadow between the falling snow, a hawk in flight. That place was his legacy. He owed it to his father, the family before him, and the ones to come in the future to get over his fears, buck up and do the right thing, the brave thing, the difficult thing. He'd been through tough times. He could face whatever came his way. He blinked again, searched for the bird, then turned his attention back to the scene below. Rushing through the town square, he saw a small figure in a pink coat. Sadie, his tweetheart, his Valentine, the girl he loved. He called to her from above and realized it was never too late. He flew out of the room, down the stairs, and into the night. Chapter 13. Sadie. Amidst the driving snow and the storm of her thoughts, Sadie thought she heard her name. Then there was the actual storm blustering and blowing around her. She needed to get home to her father, to her predictable life, to nights in, simplicity, not the tangle of emotions tying her in knots. She'd almost told Tripp that she loved him when they were sitting in front of the warm glow of the fire. It came over her, all-consuming, like the flame. Of course, she'd said it in the past, but this time it felt brighter, warmer, deeper. But then she recalled Valentine's Day 3 years previous and what it cost her to love so much. She was rejected and left in a world of pain. She'd bit the words back, stuffed them away, warned them not to return. Tripp and she had tried once before. And despite all the sweet gestures throughout the day, that was just it, one day, not a lifetime of commitment. Sure, Tripp committed to his job as a firefighter, but could he dedicate himself to his family's company? Eventually, it would be spread evenly among the brothers, if they ever got back on speaking terms. But he was the oldest. She felt bad and wondered what had happened, but didn't dare ask. She sensed the wound was still raw. His family was broken. What could put them back together? What had kept hers together despite losing her mother? Love. The uncertainty from the day left her feeling hollow, cold, empty. What could fill it? Love. He'd turned his back on her, on his family, and they on him. She and her father had always stuck together. She could show him a different way, a more courageous way, an everlasting way. She wanted the fullness, warmth, and depth of a life in love, of a life with Tripp. She stopped on the snow-covered square and turned around. Her tracks disappeared under the rapidly falling snow. She had to go back, but there was no retracing her steps. She could only move forward, and she wanted to try to do it with the man she loved, Tripp Hawkins. She lifted her shoulders and chin, determined. She heard her name, she was sure of it that time, but the snow produced whiteout conditions. Only the faint glow of the town square lights dappled the otherwise thick blanket surrounding her.
Sadie, the familiar voice came again.
I'm here, she replied, feeling as if he came to her rescue, though this time she was stuck in the wide open. But she no longer felt stuck in the past. Footsteps pounded closer. Emerging from behind a curtain, Tripp came into view. They rushed toward each other, not stopping until they were in each other's arms. When they parted, she said, "Tripp, you ruined me, because I compare every man to you. But there's no one like you. You made me doubt the call of my heart, but it belongs to you. You're a tether, a rock. I'm flighty, freewheeling, a kite. You hold the tail. I can't risk my heart again, but I don't want you to let go." She felt bold, risky, speaking the words aloud. "I've been battling with the past, but all we have is right now, this moment. My father taught me that. He's living day to day while I've been stuck in the past. I want a future with you in it." Relief swept through her, and the light in Tripp's eyes told her he understood. He stroked his hand adoringly across her cheek. "Even though things have been difficult, you're the greatest gift, my best teacher. I learned and grew. I'm sorry for hurting you, but you'd rather have the man I've become through these hard lessons than the one I once was. Please, we owe it to each other to try again, if you're willing." "Yes," she said, around a smile as big as the mountain. She felt hopeful, buoyant, but she wanted to know his heart was all the way in. Her eyes widened, asking for more. "I've been fearing what it means to take over the family business. It'll be new, unknown terrain. I'll have to mend things with my brothers. None of it'll be easy. But I don't want to go partway in. I want it all, but with you." He suddenly dropped to one knee. She gasped. The snow slowed as though holding its breath, waiting for what was next. He held a small box in his hand. "I've kept this for 3 years. I messed up once, but I'm asking you, Sadie Collins, to give me another chance. It's Valentine's Day. Will you be mine? Sadie, will you marry me? Will you be mine forever?" He opened the box. Inside rested a shiny silver band, lined with diamonds and showcasing what she could only call a rock, a gift from him to her, representing how he'd be steady, true. The diamond was also giant, like the mountain, and sparkly like Tripp's eyes. She savored the moment, taking it all in, absorbing it, imprinting it in her mind. She'd stop living in the past, but she never wanted to forget the joy spilling from her heart, flooding her mind. Wherever life took them, she'd carry that with her. She placed her hand in his. "I will, Tripp. I'll marry you. You're my Valentine, always and forever." He slid the ring on her finger, and they both got to their feet, sealing the moment with a kiss that practically melted the surrounding snow. The end. This has been a reading of Second Chance in Hawk Ridge Hollow, Rich and Rugged, a Hawkins Brother romance. Written by Ellie Hall. Copyright 2019. Narrated by Lorena Hoops. Audio copyright 2020.